Chapter 862. After hearing Miranda's request, Eric did not refuse. He just asked, "Now, where are we going?" Miranda said excitedly, we can go all the way north along Route 1. It's best if we can drive to San Francisco. I haven't been to San Francisco yet. Do you think a car can run on that road? It might be midnight by the time we get to San Francisco. Eric shook his head and smiled. The road Miranda was talking about was California's Pacific Rim Highway 1, which ran through the entire state of California. The name of this road sounded very impressive at first, but in fact, it was just a small 2-lane asphalt road, and the road condition was not very good. Forget about sports cars, even ordinary cars had to slow down when they ran on it. It was impossible to experience any pleasure of driving. Then, Miranda tilted her head and thought for a while. Her eyes suddenly lit up, and she hugged Eric's neck tighter. She said, "Let's go to Las Vegas, okay? I heard from my classmates that it only takes 3 hours to drive from Los Angeles to Las Vegas." Eric felt Miranda's soft body close to him again, and he was too lazy to push her away. Miranda had changed out of her tennis uniform in the morning and chose a small t-shirt and shorts that exposed her navel. She exuded an invincible youthful aura. Sensing the faint fragrance coming from the girl's body, Eric began to consider his options. After returning from New York, he once again worked around the clock for half a month. Next, he would go to Maryland. Although it was to attend Chris's wedding, because all the executives in the Firefly system would gather, it would definitely not be much easier. Therefore, it was not a bad choice to take this opportunity to relax. Not to mention, it was a drive. When he refused to drive Cindy's Maserati in New York last time, Eric realized that he was even a little out of touch with normal life. In any case, Eric absolutely did not want to be a person who created a huge industry but imprisoned himself in it. After making a quick decision, Eric reached out and patted Miranda's little butt. He said, "Okay, let's go to Las Vegas." "Wow, Eric, I love you." Miranda was so excited that she almost jumped up. She leaned over and kissed Eric on the cheek a few times. Eric pushed the excited girl away and said, "All right, come down first. I'll make a few calls and make some arrangements." Since he had decided to go to Las Vegas at the last minute, Eric would fly to Maryland from there tomorrow. This matter definitely needed to be communicated with the assistant in charge of arranging his itinerary. In addition, although he was only staying for one night, trivial matters such as entertainment, accommodation, and even security definitely needed to be arranged in advance. After making a few consecutive calls, Eric could not help but laugh at himself. He got up and said to Miranda and Christina, "All right, let's go." Miranda immediately clung to Eric's arm, and Christina could not hide her excitement as she followed Eric. The three of them went to the underground garage together. Eric's group of bodyguards was already preparing to drive together. Miranda looked around the dozens of luxury cars with stars in her eyes. Then, she pounced on a pure black Lamborghini Ghost and clumsily tried to open the door, but did not succeed. The girl was not embarrassed. She turned her head and said, "Eric, let's drive this car, okay?" Eric shook his head and said, "This is a 2-seater. There are 3 of us." Miranda knew that it was impossible to get rid of Christina, so she looked at the other cars in disappointment. The spacious underground garage could accommodate at least 30 luxury cars, but all the sports cars in the innermost row were basically 2-seaters. Miranda did not want to sit in those old-fashioned Bentleys or Rolls-Royces. She looked around and tried to point at the bodyguards. "Christina can sit in their car." Christina could not take it anymore. "Do you think I'm easy to bully just because I'm small?" Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly paused. A smug smile appeared on her face. She took out a card from her small satchel and waved it at Miranda. Then, she looked at Eric and said, "Eric, actually, I've already gotten my driver's license." Eric smiled and took Christina's driver's license. He looked at it and said, "When did you learn to drive?" "I secretly started learning a long time ago. I got my driver's license not long after my 16th birthday," Christina said. Then she added, "Now, my mother is very relieved to let me drive the family's Chevrolet alone." "All right." Eric smiled and pointed around. Pick one that you can drive. Christina ignored Miranda's gloomy expression and deliberately walked past her. She came to the side of a purple Lamborghini and patted the hood gently. Eric, can I drive this car? Eric looked at the purple Lamborghini. It was a gift from the Lamborghini company after he finished filming Pretty Woman. However, Eric basically did not touch it in the past few years. Other than routine maintenance, the car rarely left the garage. In fact, most of the luxury cars in the garage were like this. This girl would buy some of the latest models every 2 to 3 days. Perhaps the biggest use of these luxury cars was to fill the garage and make people happy to look at them. Eric also walked over and said, Lamborghini and Chevrolet are different. It's better to pick another car. I know how to drive. Christina hesitated and stuck out her little tongue. Then, she said, I knew how to drive 2 years ago. Drew asked me to drive. Eric was a little speechless. However, when he remembered that this girl had a glorious story of driving away from home at the age of 12 before she met him, this matter did not seem so ridiculous anymore. Eric finally agreed and said, All right, but you're not allowed to drive faster than me on the road. Even so, Eric was still not at ease. After all, Christina was only 16 years old not long ago. In the end, Eric asked his bodyguard captain, Carter Moan, to sit in Christina's passenger seat and look after her. Only then did everyone set off together. A group of 7 people, 2 Lamborghinis and 2 Range Rovers. After leaving Malibu, it took more than an hour to reach Highway 15 that led directly to Las Vegas. Although it took a little longer to pass through downtown Los Angeles, it was not even 4 o'clock when they got on the highway. They were only 300 kilometers away from Las Vegas. They would reach Las Vegas at about 7 o'clock. Highway 15 was a very wide 6-lane highway. There were no ravines on both sides of the road. Instead, it was an endless Gobi Desert. Therefore, safety was very guaranteed. If there were fewer cars on the road, it would be a racer's paradise. Eric gradually regained his control as he passed through downtown Los Angeles. After entering the highway, he began to let loose. In some areas where there were fewer cars, he even sped up to 200 kilometers per hour. The adrenaline rush of excitement made him understand why so many people liked to race. To Eric's surprise, Christina drove the purple Lamborghini and followed Eric's car closely at all times. Occasionally, she would even roll down the window and naughtily stick out her little tongue at Miranda, who was sitting in the passenger seat with a gloomy face. Obviously, if it were not for Eric's restrictions, this girl's speed would definitely be much higher. This made Eric realize that this girl's level of indiscretion was definitely far beyond his imagination. She was originally such a well-behaved girl, but she had been taught to be a racer. They sped all the way. Just after 6 o'clock, they had already arrived at a small town on the border of Nevada. Everyone stopped to refuel and take a short break. Eric did not get out of the car and let the bodyguards take care of things outside. Miranda, who was sitting in the passenger seat, got out of the car and wandered around. When she came back, she began to tug at Eric's arm and act coquettishly. Eric, we're not far from Las Vegas. Let me drive for a while later, okay? I've seen it before. Eric hung up a phone call and shook his head with a smile. That won't do. Don't even think about it. But, Christina obviously knew how to drive 2 years ago. She was only the same age as me then. If I knew about this, she definitely wouldn't be driving now. Eric shook his head again and comforted her with a smile. All right, stop fooling around. I just received a call. David Copperfield will be performing magic at Caesar's Palace tonight. My assistant has already booked a private room for us. Before Miranda could answer, Christina, who was sitting in the car window next to Eric, leaned over and said excitedly, David Copperfield, the guy who made the plane disappear. Yes. Eric could not help but pinch Christina's rosy cheeks because of the racing. He said, We haven't talked about you yet. Driving the Lamborghini so smoothly, you must have broken a lot of traffic rules in the past. Hee hee. Christina's face was pressed against Eric's palm and she rubbed against it. Then, Eric, punish me tonight. Eric smiled and said, Of course, you can't run away. Hey, do you guys think I don't exist? Miranda looked at Christina with dissatisfaction. Why don't I punish you tonight too? Christina chose to ignore Miranda's words. After all, Miranda had treated her like this in the morning. She continued to say to Eric, Eric, I suddenly thought of something. Why don't you make a racing movie? It would definitely be very cool. Eric was stunned. The name of a movie flashed into his mind almost immediately. The Fast and the Furious. How could he forget this classic series? Before he was reborn, the Fast and the Furious series had already filmed its 6th installment and showed no signs of stopping. Such tenacious vitality also proved that this series could bring in enough profits for the movie company. Eric reached out and kissed Christina's little face. He said, You reminded me. I'll reward you tonight. Christina was just saying it casually. She didn't expect Eric to have such a big reaction. However, this kind of unexpected result made the girl very happy. She said, Then, Eric, can you let me play a role too? Okay. Eric nodded and said, If there's a suitable role, I'll definitely let you try it out. Maybe I can even let your role in Casino Royale be linked to this movie. The Fast and the Furious also involved a lot of special agent elements. Although Christina's role in Casino Royale was not a first-rate angel carrying out missions, it was easy for her to link up with The Fast and the Furious. As his mind continued to wander, Eric immediately came up with many ideas to combine The Fast and the Furious with the special agent movie universe. Moreover, this racing series could also enrich the entertainment elements of the special agent movie universe. After all, when top agents fought against evil forces, occasionally interspersed with an adrenaline rush, racing would also greatly relieve the aesthetic fatigue brought by the simple special agent movies. Christina saw that Eric was deep in thought, so she didn't disturb him anymore. She just proudly showed off her power to Miranda, who was sitting in the front passenger seat. Miranda also stared at her, and small sparks flew when their eyes met. It wasn't until the bodyguard came over to remind them that everything was ready that they set off again. At around 7:20 in the evening, the sun had just sunk into the horizon when the 4 cars finally drove into the underground parking lot of the Caesar Palace Hotel in downtown Las Vegas. Eric had just parked his car when he saw a middle-aged man around 40 years old run over and open the car door for him. Mr. Williams, it's a pleasure to have you here at the Caesar Palace Hotel. I'm the manager here, Richie Black. Eric reached out and shook hands with the other party. He smiled and said, Hello, Mr. Black. Richie Black patiently waited for the people in the other cars to get out. When he saw Miranda and Christina coming to Eric's side, his expression didn't change at all. He gestured with his hand and said with a smile, Please come with me. The room has been prepared for you. Eric wasn't surprised by Richie Black's hospitality. With his current identity and status, he was completely worthy of it. Moreover, it was his first time staying at the Caesar Palace Hotel. Naturally, the other party would be tactful and pay more attention to him. On the other hand, Miranda, who was originally very lively, held onto Eric's arm a little cautiously. There was less restlessness in her eyes. Christina, on the other hand, obediently followed beside Eric. Since they were staying at the hotel, the bodyguards naturally didn't need to be by their side at all times. Richie Black asked the waiter who followed him to lead the bodyguards to the guest room. He led Eric and the 2 girls into the private elevator and pressed the button before saying again, Mr. Williams, David Copperfield's performance will start at 8 o'clock. Would you like to have your meal first? Yes. Eric nodded and felt Miranda leaning against him. He smiled and said, Also, help the 2 of them prepare some clothes. Compared to Eric's more formal shirt and casual pants, the 2 girls were still wearing small t-shirts and denim shorts. Even compared to the luxurious decoration of the elevator in front of them, they looked out of place. It was no wonder that the 2 girls were so reserved. Of course, no problem. Richie Black nodded. Only then did he size up Miranda and Christina a little. He then whispered a few instructions to his assistant beside him. Chapter 863. Caesar's Palace was actually a luxurious entertainment center that included hotels, casinos, theaters, nightclubs, and other entertainment facilities. It covered an area of 30 hectares and consisted of 4 hotel buildings and a large number of ancillary entertainment facilities. Including the palace tower that had just opened, the entire hotel had more than 2,000 guest rooms. As it was open to all tourists who came to the casino to have fun, the suites in Caesar's palace were naturally divided into many levels. There were ordinary rooms that cost a few $100s a night, and luxury suites that cost tens of thousands of dollars a night. Eric did not specifically instruct his assistant to book the best suite for him. Or, to be precise, it could no longer be called a suite, but a villa apartment. The entire apartment was located at the center of the top floor of the palace tower, and it was the largest of the 5 top-grade apartments in this building. Not only was the apartment equipped with a private elevator and 24-hour butler service, the interior was decorated in the style of ancient Roman palaces and a large number of exquisite and expensive art pieces, making it look even more luxurious. Richie Black personally introduced the various facilities in the apartment to Eric, and considerately asked about the needs of Eric and the 2 girls before leaving a business card and respectfully leaving. It was already late, and Eric had no intention of going to the restaurant. He only ordered the private butler of the apartment to send dinner over and let the other party leave the room. After all the outsiders left, Miranda, who had been pretending to be a lady but could not because of the t-shirt and denim shorts she was wearing, finally relaxed. She cheered and pounced on the classic sofa. Feeling the retro table lamp on the short table beside the sofa shake a few times, the girl quickly jumped up and carefully reached out to hold it. Then, she made a face at Eric. Eric also walked to the sofa and sat down with his legs crossed. He flipped open the hotel's entertainment brochure and saw Miranda snuggling over like a kitten. Eric patted the girl's waist and looked at Christina. "You two go take a shower first. They will send the clothes over later. After dinner, we will go watch a magic show." Miranda hugged Eric's arm and shook it. She said coquettishly, "Jewelry and jewelry. I have to at least wear a necklace, right?" Eric couldn't be bothered to waste any more time and said, "Little girls are so pretty and refreshing. Why would they need jewelry?" Miranda still wanted to continue, but when she saw Christina walking toward the bathroom with a smile, she immediately jumped up. "I want the biggest one. I'm not taking a shower with you." Christina ignored him and walked into the biggest bathroom in the apartment. She closed the door behind her and retorted, "I don't want a shower with you either." Miranda glared angrily at the closed bathroom door for a while before pouncing on Eric, who was sitting on the sofa. "Eric, look at her. She's so annoying." Eric ignored the kittens fighting and continued to flip through the book in his hand without raising his head. He said, "The rule is that you are not allowed to scratch the face. I don't care about anything else." "Humph, you're a bad guy too." Miranda patted Eric lightly, and in the blink of an eye, she teased Eric to take a shower with her. Naturally, she was rejected, and she walked to the other bathroom alone gloomily. The shopping area in the plaza attached to the Caesar Palace Hotel almost covered all the famous luxury brands in the world. When dinner was delivered, the private butler of the apartment walked in with a few waiters, pushing racks of clothes and shoes for the 2 girls to choose from. There were even a few boxes of jewelry suitable for young girls. Seeing Miranda carefully pick up a ruby necklace and put it around her neck before looking at him expectantly, Eric knew that the girl remembered what he had said just now. He was just too lazy to go through the trouble. Since someone had thoughtfully taken the initiative to deliver it to him, Eric naturally didn't mind dressing his little vase up a little more prettily. He nodded and said with a smile, "Pick it. Hurry up." Miranda cheered a little and put the necklace around her neck excitedly. In the end, they didn't make it in time for the magic show. After dinner, Miranda and Christina, who had changed into 2 sets of dresses, arrived at the Magic Empire Theater in Caesar Palace. It was already 8:15. Fortunately, the best magic shows were usually saved for the last, so they didn't miss too much. The Magic Empire Theater was located next to the Plaza Tower in the 4 buildings of Caesar Palace. It was an ancient theater-style performance venue. In Eric's memory, this should be the arena theater where superstars such as Celine Dion and Elton John performed in Las Vegas. However, that should be 2,000 years later. Caesar Palace was completely renovated to accommodate Celine Dion's performance. Although there were all kinds of superstars performing in Las Vegas all year round, a long-term performance format had yet to appear. As a contemporary magician who began to rise to fame in the 70s, David Copperfield had already created many magical miracles such as making Boeing planes disappear into thin air, hiding the Statue of Liberty, crossing the Great Wall, escaping from prison, and so on. Eric had only seen videos of David Copperfield's magic shows. This was the first time he saw one in person. Christina, on the other hand, had completely forgotten that she was still holding a glass of fruit juice in her hand. She looked at David Copperfield's head displacement magic with her mouth slightly agape. In the end, she said in surprise, "Eric, how did you do that?" Eric gently put his arm around the girl's waist and said with a smile, "Why are you so curious? This kind of thing is not interesting at all if you figure it out." Miranda also looked at Christina with disdain and mocked, "If even you can figure it out, can Copperfield still perform on stage?" Christina glanced at Miranda and said with a smile, "I'm looking forward to Copperfield's magic show that makes people disappear into thin air later. Eric, let Miranda go up and be a guest, okay?" Eric smiled but didn't say anything. Miranda snorted and retorted, "It's more suitable for you to go up. She's so small. If she disappears, she may never be found again. You're tall but you're brainless. Don't you know that a black dress is more suitable for a pearl necklace? You only know how to pick expensive ones." Miranda raised her chin. "Who said that a black dress has to be matched with pearls? I saw a black dress with rubies in Vogue last month." Hearing that the two girls were starting to go straight into the professional field, Eric hurriedly interrupted them. "Stop, no more arguing tonight, or I'll chase both of you out on the street." The two girls immediately stopped bickering. Miranda even leaned over and said coquettishly, "Eric, I don't have to return the necklace tomorrow, right?" Eric pinched her cheek and said with a smile, "That depends on my mood." Miranda immediately understood that she didn't have to return the jewelry on her body. She kissed Eric on the cheek fawningly. Although she still had the black card, after that incident, Eric limited her monthly expenses to only $5,000. Such living expenses were definitely very generous for a girl of her age. The daughter of the middle-level management family of Firefly Group that she was lodging with was the same age as her, but her monthly pocket money was only $200 to $300. However, for Miranda, who had already experienced the magic of money, $5,000 a month was simply not enough to spend, let alone by the expensive clothes and jewelry on her body. After the magic show, Eric was about to leave with the two girls when the hotel waiter sent over an invitation written by David Copperfield. It turned out that it was a party held by the other party. Most of the entertainment activities in Las Vegas, including the casinos, were forbidden. At least on the surface, Miranda and Christina were not allowed to participate at all. Although these rules were useless for guests of Eric's level, he did not want to break the rules too casually. The party at the moment was a good choice. The two girls were also very interested, so they rushed over. The party was held in the banquet hall of the Plaza Tower, and there were many familiar faces who came to join in the fun. Eric exchanged a few pleasantries with David Copperfield, who personally came to greet him, before he was pulled to the dance floor by Miranda and Christina. After dancing for a while, Eric had just left the dance floor with the two girls when he heard a masculine male voice. "Hey, Eric, I just heard that you're in Las Vegas. I didn't expect it to be true, haha." Eric turned his head and saw Larry Ellison, who seemed to always have a beard, walking over with a tall vase girl. Although the other party also had a lot of properties in Malibu, the two of them could only be considered acquaintances. The last time they met was at the Fireflyer conference in early April, and they did not talk much at that time. However, since the other party acted like they were close, Eric smiled and greeted him. He reached out and shook the other party's hand. "Larry, what a coincidence." "Of course, but Eric, you really have to come to Las Vegas a few more times. This is the real paradise," Larry Ellison said, and casually introduced the female companion beside him. "This is Anouk." The girl hid the eagerness in her eyes when she looked at Eric, but she still could not help but take the initiative to reach out her hand. "Hello, Mr. Williams. I'm Anouk Lepel." "Hello." Eric gently shook the other party's hand. He felt that Lepel was a bit like a French surname, so he did not ask much. He also did not have the intention to introduce Miranda and Christina. Instead, he turned to Larry Ellison. "What about you, Larry? What have you been doing recently?" Hearing this question, Larry Ellison's expression suddenly became a lot more excited when he looked at Eric. He blurted out, "Eric, are you interested in apples?" Eric paused and said, "I don't really like to eat this. It's too troublesome to peel it." Although the three girls beside the two of them did not quite understand what the two of them were talking about, they could clearly feel that Eric was talking nonsense in a serious manner. They all giggled. "Hey you!" Larry Ellison waved his hand randomly, then said to his female companion, "Baby, can you help us get a few glasses of wine?" Anouk Lepel knew that Larry Ellison was sending her away. Although she was a little unwilling, she still tactfully nodded and walked away. Eric also smiled and said to Miranda and Christina beside him, "Okay, you guys go play by yourselves. Let me talk to Larry alone for a while." The two girls giggled and walked away. Eric and Larry Ellison came to the banquet hall's bar and ordered 2 more glasses of wine. Eric then said jokingly, "Larry, do you think I should be interested in Apple now?" They were talking about Apple Computer at this time. However, ever since Microsoft released Windows 95, Apple Computer had been on the decline. In 1995, Apple could still maintain an annual profit of $300 million, and its market value was more than $4 billion. But now, in the first quarter of 1997, Apple's losses were as high as $200 million, and its market value had plummeted to the edge of $2 billion. Larry Ellison said, "Eric, I know that Apple's situation is a little bad now, but it's still a high-tech company with a strong foundation. It's still very valuable." Eric shrugged and said, "Larry, why don't you tell me about your plan?" "Well, it's actually like this," Larry Ellison said. "I've recently been raising funds to fully acquire Apple and then hand it over to Steve. Steve Jobs, you must remember, he was one of the earliest founders of Apple. If Steve wasn't pushed out of Apple back then, the company definitely wouldn't be in this state now." Eric knew that Larry Ellison and Jobs had always been very good friends, and it was interesting in and of itself that these two men, who had so little in common in personality and character, could be friends. "Of course I remember." Eric nodded and didn't show any other emotions. He continued to ask, "So, how much money have you raised now?" Larry Ellison coughed twice and said, "Right now, not much, but Eric, if you are willing to invest a part of it, I think there will definitely be more investors willing to follow. Everyone now admires your investment vision in the high-tech industry." With the explosion of technology stocks in recent years, Larry Ellison, who owned a large number of Oracle shares, was worth tens of billions of USD. However, his personal assets were basically stocks. In order to maintain control of Oracle, these stocks were certainly not to be sold at will. Larry Ellison couldn't use Oracle's funds at will, so he was far from having a large amount of cash at his disposal like Eric. With Apple's current situation, all investors would only be deterred. It would be difficult for Larry Ellison to raise funds to realize a controlling stake in Apple, let alone fully buy Apple. As for Apple, Eric now had an indifferent attitude. Without the halo of Pixar, Jobs was still barely running Next Computer. Moreover, due to the increasingly poor performance in recent years, Jobs had even given up the hardware business and relied only on licensing Next Computer's software to maintain the company's operations. Therefore, although Apple was on the verge of bankruptcy, it didn't extend an olive branch to him again. Chapter 864. The two chatted for a while, listening to Larry Ellison talk about the bright future after the acquisition of Apple. Eric suddenly thought of another thing and said, "Larry, there seems to be a very important question here. You want to buy Apple and hand it over to Steve, but did he agree?" Larry Ellison was stunned and wondered, of course Steve would agree. Why wouldn't he agree? Eric shrugged and said, "As a good friend of Steve's, you must know his character better than I do. I happen to know about his house in Woodside. I think maybe Steve would prefer to see Apple disappear like that house." Eric had heard the anecdote about Jobs' house in Woodside, San Francisco, by chance. It also happened to reflect the paranoid and indifferent side of Jobs' character. After becoming a billionaire by founding Apple, Jobs bought a mansion in Woodside. He was dissatisfied with the style of the villa in the mansion and wanted to tear it down and rebuild it. However, because the villa, built in the late 19th century, was considered to be of high historical value by the Woodside City Council, Jobs' request was not approved. So, Jobs took a very extreme approach. He opened all the doors and windows of the house and completely left it to the elements without any maintenance. A few years later, the dilapidated villa was deemed to be in disrepair, and Jobs got what he wanted. Larry Ellison obviously knew about this. He immediately shook his head and said, "Eric, this is completely different. I know Steve. No one cares about Apple more than he does. As long as I buy the company, he will definitely come back." "Well," Eric said, "if you can get a definite answer from Jobs, maybe I can consider a sum of money." If Firefly Electronics did not have a strong enough competitor at all, it was almost inevitable that they would slack off. Or, it would be like raising a dog to bite a rabbit. With Firefly Electronics having the upper hand, Eric was also looking forward to Jobs continuing to come up with something that would change the world. Although he had received Eric's promise, Larry Ellison was still a little impatient. He asked, "Eric, how much can you pay?" Firefly Group and Firefly's investment funds had already been planned. Eric thought of the $300 million invested in the Southeast Asian foreign exchange market and said, "I just happen to have that much money. I plan to buy a Boeing 777 in the near future, and there will be some left over." Larry Ellison was obviously very familiar with private jets. He quickly said, "Eric, you seem to be mistaken about one thing. If you place an order now, you only need to pay a deposit. When the plane is delivered in 2 or 3 years, you will pay the full amount. So, you should have at least $300 million now, right?" Eric had forgotten this point. A private jet was different from a luxury car. It could be picked up at any time. As for a large Boeing aircraft, it would take a few years from the time the order was placed to the time it was delivered. "If that's the case," Eric continued, "maybe we can get $600 million by then." "Wow!" Larry Ellison exclaimed. He looked at Eric with a gaze that he had not used for many years. Although he had a net worth of tens of billions, he could only use tens of millions of dollars most of the time. Larry Ellison originally thought that this year's Forbes World's Billionaires list had overestimated Eric's net worth. But now, he could not help but dispel his doubts. Perhaps Eric Williams was the only person in the world who could casually take out $600 million in cash. Eric quickly poured a cup of cold water on Larry Ellison and said, "But, Larry, I will definitely not invest all of this money in Apple." Larry Ellison immediately nodded. His original idea was to use Eric's excellent investment vision in the IT field as a gimmick. As long as he could get a symbolic sum of money from Eric, it would be much easier to raise funds from other investment companies under Eric's name. Larry Ellison did not expect to be able to pull in $600 million in one go. "Then, Eric, as long as you are willing to take out $300 million, I promise to raise all the funds within 3 months." Larry Ellison originally wanted $50 million. If it was less, Eric would not be able to exert his influence. But now, he naturally increased the amount. The more money Eric invested, the more likely it would be for other investment companies to follow. Since Eric decided to participate in this matter, he naturally did not want to just be an insignificant small shareholder. Apple's current market value was $2 billion. If he launched a full acquisition, he would definitely have to pay a certain premium. But $300 million could guarantee that Eric would hold more than 10% of the shares. "Okay, $300 million it is." Eric nodded and added, "Also, don't forget the premise I just said. If Jobs is not willing to return, this matter is over." "Of course." Larry Ellison grinned and raised his glass to Eric. He said, "Then I wish us all the best in advance." Eric also smiled and clinked his glass with Larry Ellison's. Seeing the other party raise his head and drink it in one gulp, he only took a small sip. Larry Ellison put down the empty glass and stopped talking about Apple. He said, "Eric, do you want to go to the casino to play a few rounds?" Eric pointed to the 2 girls on the dance floor and said, "Forget it this time." Larry Ellison turned his head and looked at the 2 girls. He said, "It's okay, bring them along. I'm sure no one will stop you, the richest man in the world, from entering." When Miranda and Christina noticed Eric's gesture, they thought that Eric was calling them. They immediately gave up dancing and walked over. Larry Ellison's female partner also appeared next to him. Eric put his arm around Christina's waist and said half-jokingly, "Actually, Larry, I'm a person who is afraid of losing, so I try to avoid places like casinos as much as possible." "Haha, okay, in that case, Anouk and I will go play first." Larry Ellison made a phone call again and hugged his female partner. He said, "If there's anything, call me any time." The two sides already had a way to contact each other. Eric smiled and nodded. After watching Larry Ellison leave, Eric withdrew his gaze and saw Miranda sitting on a high stool next to the bar. She skillfully gestured to the bartender for a cocktail. The bartender just glanced at her and glanced at Eric. He did not say anything and quietly mixed a cocktail and sent it over. Miranda saw that Eric was staring at her. She picked up the glass and took a small sip. She smacked her lips and pushed the glass over. She smiled and said, "Eric, actually, I ordered it for you." Eric ignored Miranda's explanation. This girl's whole face was red. It was obvious that she had more than one drink. He looked up at his watch. It was already 10 o'clock when the magic show ended. After chatting with Larry Ellison for so long, it was almost 11 o'clock. "It's almost 11 o'clock. Are you tired? Do you want to go back and rest?" Christina was a little indifferent, but Miranda said, "Eric, I want to go to the casino to take a look." The girl obviously heard the conversation between Eric and Larry Ellison just now. She added, "We're just going to take a look. We're not gambling, okay?" Eric shook his head and said firmly, "Not at all." Miranda pouted, but soon her eyes lit up. She leaned over and shook Eric's arm sneakily. "Eric, let's go watch the late-night show, okay? I just heard them talking about it." "What late-night show?" Eric asked subconsciously, but he quickly realized what she meant. He smiled and knocked Miranda's head. "Is that something you can see?" Miranda quickly shook her head. No, I heard them say that it's a stage show. I think it's called. Miranda tilted her head and forgot what to say for a moment. On the other side, Christina continued, "Helen's face. It's the story of Helen in the Battle of Troy." Eric had never heard of such a stage show. He thought that it might be exclusive to Caesar Palace. After all, this hotel's characteristic was the ancient Greek and Roman style. Seeing that the two girls were curious and looking forward to it, Eric no longer refused. He called the private butler of his suite. In less than 5 minutes, the private butler of the apartment appeared in person and led Eric and the other two out of the party. They rushed to another small theater in Caesar Palace that was more luxuriously decorated. The show started at 11 o'clock. After arranging a private room for Eric and the other two and serving them snacks and drinks, the private butler of about 40 years old left quietly. However, just as Eric sat down on the sofa in the private room and glanced at the stage, he immediately realized that it was obviously that kind of show. Moreover, it was definitely much bigger than the ordinary strip club. The lights in the theater quickly dimmed. After a simple announcement, the music started. When a group of gorgeous girls wearing only red underwear appeared on the stage, Miranda and Christina, who were originally looking forward to the stage show, exclaimed softly. Looking at the extravagant scene on the stage, Eric suddenly remembered a movie in his memory. It was the NC-17 rated No Beautiful Women by the Dutch director Paul van Hoven. However, the gorgeous stage show in that movie was obviously incomparable to the more extravagant show in Caesar Palace. It seemed that the No Beautiful Women in the original space-time was filmed in 1995. However, it was now 1997 and Eric had never heard of this movie again. It seemed that it was another side effect of the butterfly effect. However, the movie that almost directly caused the bankruptcy of Carlock Pictures was indeed unnecessary. Smiling and reaching out to cover Miranda's eyes, Eric said, "Okay, are you satisfied now?" The exclamation of the two girls just now was probably just out of the shyness of women. After all, if they did not react in this kind of situation, it would definitely not be solemn enough. Pushing Eric's hand away, Miranda curiously looked at the performance on the stage. This was a palace scene. The story was indeed adapted from the story of the Battle of Troy in Greek mythology. However, the scantily dressed performers on the stage obviously could not let anyone focus on the plot. After watching quietly for a while, Miranda finally stuck to Eric's side. Her eyes were still looking at the stage as she exclaimed, "Why are there so many girls willing to perform this kind of thing? It's too." Miranda still couldn't think of any suitable adjectives. Eric pinched the girl's face and said, "Do you think everyone is like you, living like a princess?" "Hee, I'm not a princess." Miranda quickly laughed again. She was tired of Eric and said, "Eric, can I be your Helen?" Eric nodded with a smile. "Of course, but I have more than one Helen by my side." "Seriously, you're so annoying." Miranda pouted again. "Don't you know how to coax girls? I'm better at coaxing with practical actions." "Oh." Miranda dragged her voice and reached over with a smile. She scratched a certain part of Eric's body and suddenly laughed out loud. "Hee, I'm sure of one thing now." Eric pushed Miranda's hand away and smiled. "Stop fooling around. Eric, others can't see us here. That's other people's business. I'm not used to this kind of situation." Okay. Miranda rubbed against Eric's body like a kitten and even moved close to his ear. She seductively said, "Let's see how long you can last." Eric did indeed watch the 1-hour performance to the end. Apart from the 2 restless little fairies beside him that made him have the urge to turn into a beast from time to time, as a normal man, he enjoyed this kind of extremely stimulating performance. When they left the theater, it was already past midnight. For a city that never slept like Las Vegas, midnight was definitely not the end of the day. However, after a 4-hour drive in the afternoon and a crazy night, Eric and the 2 girls were already very tired. They did not look for other entertainment activities and returned to the suite in the palace tower to rest. The next day, he still woke up at 8 o'clock. It was not that Eric was very diligent, but he had to fly to Maryland on the East Coast today. He had a full 4 hours of sleep on the plane. Miranda and Christina saw that Eric had woken up and forced themselves to get up, but they looked like 2 lazy and sleepy kittens. After breakfast, the 2 girls insisted on sending Eric to the airport. Chapter 865. Since they were leaving Las Vegas, Eric was not at ease leaving the 2 girls alone in the city of sin. He simply sent them to the plane to Los Angeles at the airport before taking the Firefly Group's Gulfstream business jet to Maryland with his entourage. It was almost 2 o'clock when he finally fell asleep last night. After the plane took off, Eric began to catch up on sleep. When he woke up again, the Gulfstream business jet had already arrived in the sky above Maryland. Maryland was located on the east coast of the United States and was close to Washington. The area was not too big, only tens of thousands of square kilometers. Looking down from the porthole of the plane, one could see large areas of green woodland and farmland. The terrain seemed to be more like hills than flat plains. Although they set off from Las Vegas at 8 o'clock in the morning, when they landed at the Frederick City Airport in northern Maryland 4 hours later, it was already 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Frederick City Airport was very small. There were no fences, and it was a completely open structure. There were only 2 runways in the airport, and most of the parked around were only mini propeller planes. After the plane landed on the runway, Eric walked down the gangway. Jeffrey, wearing a cowboy hat and plain clothes, had already brought Chris and the others to greet him. At first glance, Jeffrey seemed to have lost some weight, but he was obviously more energetic. If he rode a horse and hung a revolver at this time, he would obviously look like a Western cowboy. As soon as he approached, Jeffrey gave Eric a big bear hug without hesitation. "Hey, Eric, you're finally here." "Yeah, there are always too many things," Eric explained. He patted Jeffrey on the back and smiled. "Jeffrey, you look younger." Jeffrey also laughed without any modesty. "Haha, everyone thinks so." After a simple greeting, Eric hugged Chris again and joked. It's the day after tomorrow. How do you feel? I'm numb, Chris said with a self-deprecating smile. He then introduced the two young men behind him and Jeffrey, who were his cousins. Eric shook hands with two young men who were about the same age as him but were rather reserved. Chris said, "Everyone is waiting for you in the farm. Let's go." Eric nodded. Together with his assistant Peter Ritchie and 4 bodyguards, he left the airport in 4 separate cars driven by Chris and the others, heading towards Jeffrey's farm. Driving north along the highway that crossed Frederick City, looking from the ground, the surrounding undulating hills became more obvious. Woodlands and farmlands intersected. It was early summer, and the green, full of vitality, made people feel relaxed and happy. Half an hour later, the cars left the highway and drove east for less than 5 kilometers before arriving at their destination. It was a small farm with about a dozen families. Around the farm was Jeffrey's farm, which was about 2,000 acres, equivalent to 8 square kilometers. Along the way, Jeffrey was excitedly introducing the farm. Although it was called a farm, in fact, only a quarter of the land was planted with wheat and other crops. Other than that, there was also a part of the dense woodlands, and the rest was pasture. Horses, cows, and sheep could be seen from afar. The dozen families in the farm were basically the farm's workers and tenants. There were more than a dozen people standing on the asphalt road at the entrance of the farm. After Eric got out of the car, he could roughly recognize most of them. Joanna, Virginia, Emily, and other women were standing together. Of course, there were also the 3 little ones. Others were John Chambers, Steve Keyes, Yoma Oliveira, Ian Neer, and other senior members of the Firefly system. The others were probably the relatives of Chris and Emily. Just when everyone was about to exchange greetings, a small figure called out for her father and rushed over. Amidst the laughter of everyone with different expressions, Eric did not shy away. He intimately carried Emma and asked, "Have you been naughty recently?" "No, Emma is very obedient." The little one wrapped her arms around Eric's neck and said crisply, "I even learned how to ride a horse. Daddy, let's go ride a horse together, okay?" "Oh, Emma is great, but not now," Eric praised and handed the little one to Joanna, who was walking over. Only then did he exchange greetings with everyone one by one. He also got to know Emily's parents and some other relatives of Chris's family. Most of the guests would come on the day of the wedding, so there were not many guests in the farm at the moment. After chatting for more than 10 minutes, everyone temporarily dispersed. Jeffrey's house was on the east side of the farm. Eric, Jeffrey, and the others walked towards the house together. Kevin, who was carrying Virginia all the way, passed by the center of the farm. Eric suspiciously noticed a group of people who were obviously special agents checking around the area. He looked at Chris curiously. John Chambers and the others would definitely bring some security, but they should not be so ostentatious. Eric did not need to say anything. Chris understood his doubts and explained, "The president and his wife will be here on the day of the wedding. These people are from the Special Task Force." Eric raised his eyebrows slightly. "You invited them?" Chris shook his head and said, "I received a call from the White House 3 days ago. They said that the president and his wife happened to be free on the 20th, and Washington is very close to here. So, I can't refuse." Eric smiled and did not say anything. In addition to John Chambers and other business executives who had already rushed over, because of the connections Chris had in recent years, there would definitely be heavyweight business bigwigs like Warren Buffett who would come to attend Chris's wedding on the day of the wedding. When the time came, the business executives who gathered in this small farm would control enterprises with a total assets of more than $200 billion. The 2 people in the White House only needed to donate a sum of money to the government to attend other people's events. Naturally, they would not let go of this opportunity to exert their influence. Although Eric would not completely cut off contact with the political world, he would not take the initiative to make friends with the government's higher-ups either. But if the other party took the initiative to come to him, he would not refuse. Building a good relationship with the president was not a bad thing for Firefly. Many rich people in the United States had the habit of buying land to become farmers. In the media industry, Ted Turner, a major shareholder of CNN, was one of the largest private farmers in the United States. He owned tens of thousands of square kilometers of private land. Jeffrey's farm was also bought from a businessman. The other party originally only wanted to use it as a place to relax. Therefore, there was a very exquisite brick villa in this residential farm. Not only was it beautiful, but its biggest feature was that it had a lot of rooms. It was more than enough to accommodate 10 or 20 guests. However, at this time, the villa was mainly occupied by the relatives of Chris and Emily. John Chambers and the others were arranged to live in a few other residences. Eric was also a relative, so he also lived in Jeffrey's house. After everything was settled, it was already evening. The wedding was the day after tomorrow, and there were many trivial things to prepare for the next day. Everyone just had a simple gathering in the evening and went to bed early. Although they wanted to get rid of their busy work temporarily, it was not an easy thing to do. Early the next morning, it was a new week. Eric had just woken up and did not even have time to eat breakfast when Peter Ritchie sent a document and a few specially marked newspapers to him. It turned out that after nearly a month of review, the federal court in San Francisco, California officially rejected the request of Sony, EMI, and BMG to ban the sale of MP3 audio format players. The official press conference would officially start at 9 o'clock in the western United States. However, the news had already been leaked in advance and was published on the important pages of major mainstream newspapers in the United States. In less than 2 months after its launch, Firefly Electronics' Fireflyer had already sold 250,000 units, far surpassing the promotion speed of portable players such as the Walkman and MD Walkman. Moreover, this was under the condition that the Fireflyer's production capacity was limited. Due to the popularity of the Fireflyer and the wide-ranging social influence formed by hunger marketing and other methods, everyone realized that the Fireflyer player had great potential to replace mainstream portable players. Therefore, from the moment Sony and several other companies jointly filed a lawsuit, the entire music industry was paying close attention to the possible reaction of the federal court in San Francisco. Chris had also woken up early and received the news. It was just past 7 o'clock. Eric and Chris were taking a stroll around the farm. They were flipping through the documents of the San Francisco Federal Court. After reading a few pages of the document, Chris rolled it up and said to Eric, "Sony will not give up. Although they will not submit the same lawsuit to a higher federal court after this case is rejected, they will still look for other ways to break through." Sony's current market value of more than $50 billion was supported by portable music players and related industries. It was impossible for Sony to give up on Fireflyer so easily. Eric was not too worried. From this lawsuit, he could tell that the US was Firefly's home ground. Even if Sony found other ways to break through, they would be weakened by their home ground advantage. Actually, if I were Nobuyuki Ide, I would give up on this pointless attempt and push for the development of digital music players. Although we have the upper hand, if Sony is determined enough, they can still pose a threat to us. Chris said. Maybe Nobuyuki Ide has this idea. But it will be very difficult for him to push for the implementation of this plan. Sony's corporate structure is too fragmented. The hardware department has its own interests, and the entertainment department has its own interests. If Nobuyuki Ide wants to sacrifice the interests of any of the parties to push for an upgrade, he will be strongly opposed by the internal conservative forces. So, this plan is basically impossible. Eric looked at Chris with a smile and said, "Do you think that my plan for the Fireflies is too scattered?" Chris did not answer Feng Yu's question directly. He only said, "Victor and Bill had mentioned to me more than once that they want to take back Firefly's online music store." Eric asked, "What do you think?" Chris said, "Currently, Yahoo has close to 50 million registered users in North America. More than 5 million of them used Yahoo Pay's platform to make online payments. This is the reason why the online music store can sell 1 million songs in 5 days. If Firefly Electronics were to do this alone, they would have to waste a few years just to expand their user base. It will take a long time for them to achieve stable revenue. Yahoo's registered users started accumulating after the launch of Internet Explorer in 1992. It took them 5 years to grow to 50 million users. The large number of registered users was Yahoo's most valuable resource. If Firefly Electronics operated the online music store alone, Yahoo would have no reason to open up its user base to Firefly Electronics without any reservations. Chris obviously saw this more clearly than Victor Mike Nelly and Bill Olson of Firefly Electronics. Or perhaps, Victor Mike Nelly and Bill Olson also knew this, but as the managers of Firefly Electronics, they were instinctively more inclined to fight for more benefits for the company they were in charge of, even if these benefits would even hinder the overall development of the Firefly system. To put it more seriously, selfishness was the nature of everyone. This would not change even if the end of the world came. Eric shook his head slightly and said, "Let's not talk about this for now. How is the operation in Southeast Asia?" Chris said, "The position building is almost done. We can probably build a short position of $3 billion. Most of them are half-year foreign exchange contracts." It was now late May. There was only a month left before the international hot money attack on the Southeast Asian currency system. The size of the short position against the entire Southeast Asian currency system might have exceeded $100 billion. Building a $3 billion position with $700 million was only about 4 times leverage. Although it did not meet Eric's expectations, he also knew that it was not easy to reach this level under the watchful eyes of a pack of wolves. Speaking of this, Eric remembered about Apple and said, "One more thing, I met Larry Ellison the night before yesterday. He is currently raising funds to buy Apple. I think this is a good opportunity, so I agreed to invest a part of it." Well, about $300 million. That's the money in the foreign exchange market. Chris's face flashed with a hint of surprise, but he quickly calmed down. After all, this was not the first time Eric made an unexpected investment move. However, he still said, "About Larry Ellison wanting to buy Apple, there has been news in the industry more than once, but he has not made any substantial moves. He is very good friends with the founder of Apple, Steve Jobs, and he has always wanted Steve Jobs to take over the company again." "However," Chris shrugged and said, "Eric, although I don't know what you are thinking, I still don't recommend you do this. Although Microsoft won't kill Apple because of the anti-piracy case, with the current strong position of the Windows system, unless Apple takes the initiative to join the Windows camp, it will be difficult for them to have much room for development. Actually, I am optimistic about Jobs' return, so I agreed to invest this money. Perhaps you know that Jobs is a paranoid person. I have always felt that paranoid people are more likely to succeed than others," Eric explained. "Moreover, Apple's fixed assets are still very large. Even if it goes bankrupt in the future, we won't lose too much." Chris nodded and said, "Well, I will take some time to pay attention to this matter." Eric joked, "So, you really don't plan to go on a honeymoon with Emily?" Chris gestured around with his eyes and smiled. "The scenery here is good. We plan to stay here for 2 weeks after the wedding. Treat it as a honeymoon, and we can also spend time with Dad." As the two chatted, they unknowingly walked to the end of the path. In front of them was a dense forest, and it was said that there were wild boars in the forest. They definitely could not walk anymore. Just a few steps back, Joanna's sister, Eva Pakula, waved at them from afar. It seemed that she wanted to have breakfast. Eric and Chris quickened their pace back to the farm. Chapter 866. The lawsuit filed by Sony Records, BMG, and EMI on the grounds that Fireflyer encouraged the spread of pirated music was dismissed by the San Francisco Federal Court. This indicated that this electronic product had an official legal market position and would not be subject to similar legal risks in the future. With the unstoppable development of the Fireflyer player, traditional portable music player manufacturers were almost destined to suffer a strong and even devastating impact. Stimulated by this news, when the New York Stock Exchange opened in the morning, the stock prices of traditional portable music player manufacturers, led by Sony, dropped significantly. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the San Francisco Federal Court officially held a press conference to announce this news. Sony's stock price had dropped by 2.7%. Within a few hours, nearly $1.5 billion of market value was gone. Coincidentally, the industry's leading financial newspaper, The Wall Street Journal, valued Firefly Electronics at $1.5 billion US. Although Firefly Electronics was not a listed company, this news was still reflected in the stock market. It was Seagate Technology, the company that first developed a 1-inch microhard drive. The original commission development agreement stipulated that Firefly Electronics had exclusive rights to the microhard disk for 3 years after the company released the first microhard disk-related product. Correspondingly, Firefly Electronics had to prioritize the purchase of microhard disk products from Seagate Technology. As the largest mechanical hard drive manufacturer in the original universe, Seagate's strength was far from traditional technology giants such as IBM, Hitachi, and Toshiba. Last year, Seagate only shipped 5 million units of mechanical hard drives, which was less than 10% of the overall market share of mechanical hard drives. Although the research and development of microhard drives was not difficult, IBM and other sophisticated hard drive manufacturers might only need half a year to come up with a mature product. However, because Seagate Technology had the advantage in advance and had a priority supply agreement with Firefly Electronics, it was destined to become the main supplier of Firefly's built-in microhard drives in the next few years. Almost no one was sure to what extent Firefly's sales capacity would explode to. Although the price of microhard drives was much cheaper than traditional hard drives, Seagate Technology's microhard drive business could even reach the scale of traditional hard drives due to the quantity advantage. After a series of news releases that day, while the stock prices of traditional portable music equipment manufacturers such as Sony fell, Seagate Technology's stock price skyrocketed by 12% in just one morning. Perhaps to further stimulate the stock price, the CEO of Seagate Technology held a press conference at noon and showed the media the 2G microhard drive prototype that Seagate had successfully developed. He also said that this product might be used in the next generation of Firefly players. While the market was fluctuating due to the news related to Firefly, an unexpected episode occurred. A New York newspaper actually dug up the news that Firefly Electronics had first contacted IBM, hoping to develop a microhard drive. However, due to IBM's arrogant and slow response, the cooperation invitation was rejected. In recent years, under the leadership of the new CEO, Gerstner, although IBM had begun to recover, its situation was far from what it used to be. Now, Microsoft's market value was on the verge of overtaking IBM. Although the hard drive manufacturing was only a marginal business of IBM, this news revealed that IBM had a lot of internal problems. This traditional high-tech giant had to be cautious. IBM CEO, Gerstner, even personally appeared in front of the media to explain this small matter. Maryland. Jeffrey's farm. Although the farm was disturbed by all kinds of news from the outside world from time to time, there was still a joyous atmosphere in the small, idyllic farm. The wedding would be held on the lawn behind Jeffrey's house. In order to cater to most of the guests' schedules, the wedding ceremony was set at 11 a.m. tomorrow instead of the traditional afternoon. The wedding venue on the lawn was surrounded by flowers at this time. Some people were still doing a final inspection of the venue, and the pleasant fragrance of the flowers floated in the air. Eric and Chris welcomed the guests who were still arriving. In addition to the guests who would arrive tomorrow, there would still be guests coming from afar today, such as Katzenberg, Victor Mike, Nelly, Bill Olson, Jeff Bezos, and so on. Although it was already summer, the weather in the farm was not hot at all. He was busy until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. After a simple meal, Eric took a break and went to the lawn behind the villa. There was a simple rehearsal for the wedding ceremony. Of course, it was mainly a rehearsal for the flower boy and the ring boy. Although they had a good relationship with Emily, Joanna and Virginia were not suitable to be bridesmaids. However, Joanna's sister, Eva Pakula, would join in the fun. For the sake of the two women, Eric also declined the role of the best man for Chris and gave it to one of Chris's cousins. However, the three little guys would be the flower boy and ring boy at the wedding. On the lawn, in addition to Joanna and Virginia, Jeffrey and Emily's parents, Jack and Melissa Britton, were also present. There were other relatives of both parties around them. Everyone was watching the performance of the 5 or 6 little guys with smiles on their faces. Eric greeted Jeffrey and the others and went to sit beside Virginia and Joanna. Looking at the wedding master in the middle aisle, who was racking his brains to coax a group of restless little guys, he smiled and asked Virginia, Can't we just use a pair of flower boys and ring boys? There are so many little guys. Won't there be trouble tomorrow? For this kind of thing, even if there is a little trouble, everyone will laugh it off, Virginia explained, and then added in a low voice, there are so many relatives and friends. It's not easy to arrange with only 2 children. Eric nodded. Taking advantage of the fact that everyone's attention was on the little guys, he reached out and hugged Virginia's waist. He smiled and asked, "Are you jealous?" Virginia turned her head and stared at Eric with a smile. "I'm so jealous. What do you plan to do? Why don't we have a wedding too? I haven't taken wedding photos of 3 people. You and Joan can do it together." "Bah, you bastard. I'm too lazy to bother with you," Virginia spat and leaned on Eric. She raised her left hand and shook the rose gold ring inlaid with a ruby on her ring finger. "Joan and I have discussed it. If you don't treat us well in the future, the 2 of us will take Kevin and Shashya to Europe and never see you again." Eric smiled. "The 2 of you are secretly plotting something like this?" "Yeah." Virginia rolled her eyes at Eric and said, "Also, you still have to pay alimony. $1 billion a year. Not a cent less." "Wow." Eric's face was full of shock. His voice was trembling as he said, "How did you calculate this number?" Virginia was very self-righteous. "Of course, we calculated it casually. What if I don't give it to you? Joan and I will find a new father for Shashya and Kevin." Eric immediately raised his hands and surrendered. "Okay, I admit defeat." Joanna, who had been listening to their soft conversation, reached out and slapped them. She smiled gently and said, "Don't talk nonsense." Virginia smiled as she reached out to hold Eric's arm. She looked at her precious son with a doting gaze and said, "I have something to discuss with you. Kevin and Shashya should both go to school. There aren't any suitable schools in the Hamptons." Eric thought for a while and said, "Why don't the 2 of you move to Manhattan? There are more private schools there." However, Virginia shook her head and said, "Joan and I are used to living in the Hamptons. Manhattan is too noisy. But we can't just set up a school for the 2 of them, right?" Eric's unintentional words happened to poke Virginia's heart. The woman said, "Why not? Back then, Rockefeller set up a school for his children. It's the Browning Private School in Manhattan. Your net worth now is not much worse than the Rockefeller family's, right?" Eric shook his head and said, "Setting up a school is not just a matter of money." Virginia insisted, "Anyway, you can pay for it. Joan and I will do the rest." Eric could only compromise. He knew that Virginia and Joanna valued the education of their children more than him. Therefore, he had nothing to worry about. He said, "Okay, I'll pay for it. You can do whatever you want." After a busy day of preparation, many people did not rest that night. The next day, as soon as the sky brightened, the farm became lively again. After breakfast, the guests who could only stay in Frederick due to the limited space in the farm began to arrive one after another. Although the wedding was not as grand as the so-called wedding of the century that many rich people often bragged about, there were still 200 to 300 guests. 3 hours before the wedding began, the farm was already bustling with noise. Frederick was only more than 60 kilometers away from Washington, D.C. At 9 o'clock, the Clintons arrived at the farm by helicopter. Although Chris could not be regarded as a public figure, his wedding still attracted a lot of media attention because of his rising reputation in the North American business world in recent years, coupled with the large number of important guests who were present this time. Although the entire farm was private property, it was not easy to prevent reporters from sneaking in and taking photos secretly. Eric only felt that the biggest advantage of the Clintons' arrival was that they did not have to worry about stopping the media reporters who wanted to spy on the wedding. The special task force agents scattered around the farm took the initiative to help them. Everyone originally wanted to completely private the wedding and not accept any media interviews. However, since the Clintons had come, the White House hoped that there would be media reporters present. After a simple discussion, Eric arranged for 3 reporters from ABC, the New York Post, and the Washington Post to come to the wedding. ABC was the property of the Firefly Group. The New York Post belonged to the News Corporation. The Washington Post was introduced by Warren Buffett, and Berkshire Hathaway was the major shareholder of the Washington Post. At 11 o'clock, all the guests were seated. The music started, and the groomsmen, bridesmaids, and flower girls came out one after another. Eric sat near the aisle and watched his son and daughter walk in front. Kevin held a ring pillow in his hand and looked solemn. This was obviously the result of Virginia's repeated teachings. Hawaii carried a small flower basket and looked around curiously. Emma, who was behind Hawaii, threw petals excitedly. It seemed that the little girl's flower basket would be empty before they reached the end of the red carpet. Then, the groom entered the ceremonial stage. Everyone immediately got up to welcome the arrival of the bride. Under everyone's gaze, a series of wedding procedures, speeches, vows, exchanging of rings, hugs, and kisses were quickly completed. When all the ceremonies were over, Chris and Emily temporarily left to take photos. The guests also began to leave the wedding venue and rush to the adjacent open-air banquet venue. As soon as Eric got up, Emma, who was wearing a pink flowery dress, pounced on him. Compared to his son and daughter, Emma seemed to be more clingy to him. Seeing the little girl stretch out her arms to ask for a hug, Eric smiled and reached out to carry her. "Daddy, I still have petals. They smell so good." The little girl hugged Eric's neck with one hand and opened her other hand to put the petals in her palm next to Eric's nose. "Smell it." Eric sniffed the little girl's palm and nodded. It smells so good." "Emma smells good too." "Hee hee." The little girl smiled happily. She then held her stomach and said, "Daddy, I'm hungry." "Good girl, it's time to eat," Eric said. Seeing the Clintons walking towards him, he handed Emma to Joanna and went up to them. Clinton glanced at the two women and the three little ones before retracting his gaze. With a smile on his face, he asked in a seemingly casual manner, "Eric, you'll definitely stay in Maryland for a few more days, right?" Firefly Group, Nokia, Cisco, Qualcomm, AOL, Firefly Electronics, Amazon, and more than a dozen other companies under the Firefly system gathered in Maryland. Yoma Alala even flew over from Northern Europe. With such a big commotion, it was naturally impossible for everyone to simply eat and drink and leave. Eric naturally had a detailed plan. Next, everyone would stay at the farm for at least 3 days to collectively discuss the development of the various companies in the Firefly system and the issues of cooperation between them. Not understanding why Clinton asked this, Eric nodded. Anyway, this was not considered a secret. Seeing Eric nod, Clinton said, "It's like this. I'm recently planning to hold a high-tech entrepreneur dinner in the White House. I don't know if you're interested?" Although it was impossible for them to be re-elected, the Clintons were obviously far from giving up their ambition to govern. This was also proven in Eric's memory. Firefly Investment had gathered a group of the most popular internet high-tech companies in recent years. If they could attract this group of companies, it would definitely be a strong help for them to continue to realize their ambition to govern in the future. Eric was just a little annoyed. "If we're not interested in what you said, are you going to hold this dinner or not?" However, of course, he would not do such a boring thing to deliberately provoke the president. He quickly nodded and smiled. "Of course, Bill, I will tell them, but we will probably stay in Maryland for another 3 days." "Oh, the timing is just right." Clinton's face showed a hint of joy. He said, "By the way, you will come over at that time, right?" Eric was not so straightforward this time. He was really not interested in the Clintons. He said ambiguously, "Maybe, I have too many things to do recently, and I may not have the time." Clinton did not mind. He patted Eric on the shoulder and said, "I hope you can come." Chapter 867. 3 days after the wedding, Eric and more than a dozen senior executives of Firefly began a 3-day meeting in an empty barn on the farm. The theme of the meeting was not too formal. Eric just gave everyone the theme of digital life in the internet age at the beginning. He asked everyone to prepare a relevant speech according to the field of the company they were in charge of, and then they would discuss it together. Cisco, AOL, and Yahoo under Firefly Investments had already formed a complete industrial chain in the field of Internet technology. The layout of the future mobile Internet era based on companies such as Qualcomm, Sprint, and Nokia had also been completed. As long as these companies under Firefly Investments could achieve perfect cooperation and maintain a strong market position in the corresponding fields for a long time, then in the future, Firefly would control a huge high-tech business empire that could be said to be terrifying. This business empire was destined to have a great impact on the global economic structure and the lifestyle of ordinary people in all aspects. However, during the 3-day meeting, Eric also discovered the unstable factors in Firefly's system. On May 24th, the day after the meeting, John Chambers, Ian Neer, and others rushed to the White House to attend the banquet on the wedding day. Eric and Chris did not join in the fun. In a small pasture outside the farm, Eric and Chris leaned against the fence of the pasture and looked into the distance. Jeffrey was personally leading a pony on the pasture. Emma was excitedly riding on the pony and waving her little hands. Joanna was carefully guarding by the side. Emily and Virginia were chatting with the other 2 little guys nearby. After quietly looking at this warm scene for a while, Eric patted the thick book of meeting notes in his hand. This was the content of the meeting that Eric asked several assistants to record in real time during the meeting 3 days ago. Among them, AOL CEO Steve Case's speech on the advantages of media development of Internet companies was the subject that troubled Eric. In the original layout plan, AOL was to assume the role of an Internet service provider in the Information Industry Alliance plan. The future direction of AOL's development should also be toward comprehensive telecommunications operators like AT&T. Eric even talked to Steve Case, hoping that AOL could acquire one of the 2 established telecommunications companies, Verizon or Sprint, in the next few years. If possible, they could also expand into cable television operators. Because Eric knew that web portals, online mailboxes, and other Internet businesses would boost AOL's stock price in the next few years, he didn't restrict AOL's development in this area. He even spared no effort to provide a lot of technical support. Currently, in terms of online services such as web portals, Yahoo, which focused on this area, had a market share of 70%, followed by AOL with a market share of around 10%. Microsoft and other latecomers, who entered the market later, had the last 20%. But perhaps he was stimulated by the crazy explosion of Internet concepts in recent years. From Steve Case's speech, it could be seen that he was obviously more inclined to let AOL develop into a content provider. He even wanted AOL to go down the old path of annexing Time Warner in the original Spacetime and make AOL a comprehensive Internet media group. Although Eric had the intention of unifying Hollywood, he didn't want to see this happen at all. No one knew better than him that the current prosperous Internet industry was just a grand bubble. In his memory, AOL could be said to be the company that fell the fastest after the Internet bubble burst due to the deviation from the original development trajectory of Internet service providers. More importantly, once AOL deviated from the established trajectory, there would be a fault in the industrial chain that Eric had painstakingly built over the years. Thinking about these things, Eric said first, according to the stock price before the close yesterday, the market value of AOL has exceeded $20 billion, right? Chris nodded and said, the stock price at the close yesterday was $138, with a total market value of $27 billion. We hold 45 million shares, still 30%. Oh, Clover should have also absorbed a lot, right? Eric thought for a while and said, they have about 3 million shares. That's 32%. However, although we are the largest shareholder, we don't have absolute control, Chris said. According to the current market value of AOL, it's impossible for us to take out enough funds to pursue absolute control. Eric also showed a bitter smile. It was a mistake that he didn't hold AOL tightly in his hands. When he first invested in AOL, many things had just started. Eric didn't have the ambition he had now. To a large extent, he only invested with a speculative mentality, hoping that the other party would sell the shares for arbitrage when the stock price soared. The original decision also planted hidden dangers in the fight for control of AOL. At present, Internet-related businesses were obviously more popular with investors than the relatively traditional telecommunications business. Therefore, if Steve Case insisted on developing the online media business, even as the largest shareholder of AOL, Eric couldn't guarantee that he could oust Steve Case from the CEO position. Shaking his head self-deprecatingly, Eric asked Chris, "If we kick Steve Case out of AOL now and seize control, how confident are we?" Chris knocked on the wooden stake next to him, thought for a while, and said, "Less than 40%. AOL's development momentum is very strong now. The board of directors won't agree to us going to war with the management." AOL's situation was great. Eric also didn't want to create news of discord between the management and the major shareholders. However, if they followed Steve Case's development plan, once AOL focused on the internet media business that was inflated by the bubble but didn't have much development prospects, when the bubble burst, the AOL shares held by Firefly would quickly return to their original state. Although Yahoo also put a lot of energy into internet media content, Eric had always positioned Yahoo as a technology company. The search engine business that Yahoo had been secretly planning was the company's future. However, AOL, whose survival was based on internet access services, obviously couldn't transform in this area. Eric wouldn't allow AOL to transform in this area. After hesitating for a while, Eric asked again, "Then, what if we choose to cash out in the next few years?" If they couldn't control the development direction of AOL in the end, choosing to cash out when the stock price was high was undoubtedly the best result. The total value of the shares we hold is more than $6 billion USD. If we want to sell these shares, directly selling them in the circulation market will have a great impact on the stock price. The best way is to choose an institution to take over, but it involves a huge amount of money of $6 billion USD. This is also not an easy thing to do. Chris shook his head and smiled, then said, "What's more, based on the current situation, the stock price of AOL is far from its peak. In the next 1 or 2 years, the market value of this 30% stock will be sky high." In his memory, AOL's market value at its peak was more than $160 billion US. In Eric's view, the degree of bubble was even more than 80%. Therefore, even if he could cash out 10% of the stock at a high price, Eric would be satisfied. If he could cash out a huge sum of $16 billion US after the dot-com bubble burst, Eric could still use this money to make up for the damage caused by AOL's deviation from the track of the Firefly Information Industry Alliance. Of course, if AOL could develop according to the track set by the Firefly system, even if the dot-com bubble burst in the future, Eric would still not choose to cash out. However, this would definitely be a matter of 1 or 2 years later. Forget it, what Steve will do is still uncertain. We'd better do what we can now. Chris nodded and said, "I will take some measures to win the support of the other shareholder representatives on the board of directors. If necessary, we will try to replace Steve Case as soon as possible." In addition, AOL and Yahoo have a very close cooperation in many aspects. Do you think we need to restrict them in this regard? No, AOL is not a threat to Yahoo. Eric shook his head and said, "Restricting AOL will only affect our own interests and create opportunities for other competitors." Well, that's it for the time being. Although AOL had 30% of the voting rights on the board of directors, in the end, Eric decided to let AOL grow wild for the time being. Everything depended on Steve Case's final choice. If the other party insisted on developing the online media business, Firefly would try to replace him. If the change of management failed, Firefly would try to opt out before the bubble burst. Of course, if Steve Case allowed AOL to develop in a certain direction, the outcome would naturally be a happy one. After all, AOL would only be able to maintain its strong position in the field of internet service providers after the bubble burst. At the same time, it could also expand its business into mobile communications and other areas. But if it merged with Time Warner like the original Spacetime, once the bubble burst, AOL's business, which was basically incompatible with Time Warner's own business, was doomed to quickly decline. After staying in Maryland for 2 more days, Eric returned to Los Angeles on May 27th. At this time, the 1997 North American summer vacation had begun. The opening film of this year's summer in North America should be The Fifth Element, which Luc Besson had been preparing for many years. This sci-fi blockbuster cost 450 million francs, which was equivalent to nearly $90 million US. It was the film with the highest production cost in Europe so far. Before it was released in North America, The Fifth Element had already been released in Europe, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and other regions and had achieved decent box office results. Due to the cooperation between the two parties on Lion, the Professional, Gaoming Film Company originally hoped that Firefly could take over the North American distribution of The Fifth Element. However, Eric was not optimistic about the commercial potential of the film. In his memory, the film's reputation was completely polarized, so the box office would not be too good. What's more, the film's copyright was in the hands of Gaoming Film Company. It was not in Firefly's interest to only assume the role of a film's distributor in North America. Therefore, Eric chose to reject. After all, it was a blockbuster with special effects. Although Firefly was not interested in the distribution rights, Eric still introduced it to Fox. If the promotion was done well, such a popular CG special effects film could easily break the 100 million mark in the North American box office. However, Fox and Gaoming Film Company did not reach an agreement on the distribution rights. In the end, the distribution rights fell to Sony Pictures. Gaoming Film Company was obviously screwed over. Because Godzilla was also going to be released during the summer, Sony Pictures used almost all of their distribution resources on this highly anticipated monster movie. Not only did The Fifth Element not get the prime time slot in June or July, but the scale of the film's marketing was also far inferior to Sony's Godzilla. In the end, after The Fifth Element was released on May 16th, the box office for the first week was only $22 million. Because of this congenital deficiency, although the box office for the second week fell by only 30%, considering the blockbuster in June, the box office for The Fifth Element in North America was likely to stay between $60 million to $70 million, which was far from Gaoming Film Company's expectations. Gaoming Film Company's hopes of recouping the $90 million production cost were very slim as they failed to perform well in North America, which was the most important box office market. The experience of The Fifth Element was actually one of the reasons why commercial films in Europe could not become popular. The film market in Europe, Britain, France, Germany and other countries was very limited and could not support the survival of a large film company. Although Gaoming Film Company was the largest commercial film company in France, in Hollywood, Gaoming Film Company was only second or third tier. Such a film company, even in the United States, could not support the production and distribution of a film of The Fifth Element. As an outsider, it was even more difficult for Gaoming Film Company to succeed. Eric returned to Los Angeles. Firefly's first summer release, Prison in the Sky, was going to be officially released on May 30th. At the same time, this film would compete with Paramount's Lion King 2. Some media obviously did not forget the news that Lion King 2 was jointly banned by Firefly and Fox at the beginning of the month. Everyone was looking forward to the result of the confrontation between Prison in the Sky and Lion King 2. However, before Eric's mind completely turned to the film, he had two visitors from San Francisco, Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs. Chapter 868. Entering the Point Manor again, Larry Ellison looked at the streamlined villa on the edge of the cliff like a work of art. There was still obvious envy and desire in his eyes. Unfortunately, back then, he was even willing to exchange all of his properties in Malibu for this manor, but the other party had rejected him. Now, Eric's net worth was almost 10 times his, and the chances of him obtaining this manor were infinitely close to zero. Eric walked into the villa with Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs. He noticed Larry Ellison's expression and joked, "Larry, you seem to have more and more properties in Malibu. Are you still willing to exchange all of them with me?" Larry Ellison knew that Eric was joking, but he nodded without hesitation and smiled. "Of course, if you want, I can call the lawyer now and let them handle the handover procedures." "Oh, you really don't hold back at all," Eric said as he led the two to the reception area by the glass wall. He casually asked Jobs, who was sitting on the sofa, "Steve, what do you think of this place?" Jobs looked around and said bluntly, "If it were me, I would clean up all the messy furniture by the glass wall." The glass wall of the villa facing the sea was divided into 3 parts according to the layout of the furniture. On the easternmost side were 2 hanging space chairs, in the middle was a row of long sofas, and on the west side, where Eric and the other 2 were sitting, was a reception area. If the villa was a public place, moving all the furniture out of the way and facing the endless sea would undoubtedly give people a more open view. However, as a personal residence, it would appear empty and deserted. Mr. Jobs said this because of his perfectionist personality. Many of his apartments were said to be empty because of his obsessive choice of furniture. Eric smiled and said, "If all the furniture was removed, we would be sitting on the floor and chatting." Jobs shrugged. That might be good. As he said that, the sound of footsteps could be heard. The twins came over with coffee. One of them brought 3 cups of coffee to the 3 of them, while the other placed the coffee pot and sugar milkshakes on the coffee table in the middle. After that, Natasha, who was next to Eric, looked up at him and asked softly, "Master, do you need anything else?" Eric shook his head and said, "No, go ahead." Larry Ellison's eyes followed the twins' tall figures until they disappeared. He sighed and said, "Eric, I'm even more envious of you now. Where did you find them?" Eric joked, "You're already an old man, so don't think about it. Be careful that you don't get hollowed out." "Hey, you're not polite at all." Larry Ellison simply returned what Eric had said not long ago. After a few pleasantries, Eric turned to Jobs and got down to business. "So, Steve, you've decided to come back to Apple?" "No." Jobs shook his head and said, "I'm still thinking about it." Eric picked up the coffee and was not surprised. He asked, "Then why are you here today?" "Here's the thing, Eric," Larry Ellison said. "Steve is looking forward to being in charge of Apple again, but he also wants some guarantees." Eric's eyes flashed and said, "Larry, I don't understand." This time, Jobs took the initiative to answer. "Eric, Apple's PC business is already very dangerous. After you buy Apple, in order to give the company more buffer opportunities, I hope to get the patent for the MP3 player to expand Apple's product line." Eric already had some premonitions. When he heard Jobs' confirmation, he shook his head without hesitation and said, "Sorry, Steve, I can't promise you that." Jobs said, "If that's the case, I might not return to Apple." Eric laughed and said, "Steve, this has nothing to do with me." "No, Eric, I can see that you're very interested in Apple, just like..." Jobs paused and continued, "Just like Pixar. Otherwise, you wouldn't have set the investment conditions for Larry." "Steve, I admit that I'm very interested in Apple and you," Eric said. "But it's just interest. If this investment doesn't happen, I won't lose anything. I can even invest the money in companies with brighter prospects." Jobs was speechless for a moment and even glared at Eric angrily. Larry Ellison knew his good friend's character. He was worried that he would say something outrageous, so he quickly said, "Eric, but you should also know that if Firefly Electronics holds on to the MP3 player patent, they will definitely be subject to federal antitrust investigations in the future. Just like Intel, they license their own x86 chip architecture to AMD and other companies. Firefly Electronics is still very small. Even if there is an antitrust investigation, it will be a long time in the future." Eric still smiled and shook his head. He took a sip of coffee and said, "Moreover, Intel's x86 architecture was mandated by IBM to be licensed to other companies. It wasn't voluntary." Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs didn't give up so easily. They wanted to say something, but Eric waved his hand and said to Jobs, "Steve, the reason why I made that investment condition to Larry is that I think you might be able to save Apple. So, what you need to do is to bring the company back to life after Larry completes the acquisition of Apple, instead of looking for another way out now. If you don't have the confidence to revive Apple, and you need some assurance before you are willing to go back, then I will now take back the investment promise I made a few days ago." Jobs stared at Eric for a while, then suddenly got up and said, "Well, I think I should leave." With that, Jobs walked straight out. Eric sat on the sofa and didn't move. He smiled as he watched Jobs leave. Larry Ellison got up helplessly and shouted, "Hey, stop, why can't you be a little more patient?" Jobs completely ignored Larry Ellison and continued to walk out of the mansion. Seeing Larry Ellison in a dilemma, Eric put down his coffee cup, got up, patted Larry Ellison on the shoulder, and said, "Okay, Larry," he agreed, "so you should go back and continue to raise funds." Larry Ellison certainly knew that Jobs was more arrogant than many people thought. After Eric's provocative words, Jobs certainly wouldn't put down his reserve and ask for a patent authorization for the MP3 player. "Steve cares about Apple more than anyone else. I knew he would go back, but—" Larry Ellison shook his head and smiled bitterly, then said, "Eric, Steve is very vengeful. You definitely won't be able to get anything good from him in the future." "Well, I really don't care. It's hard to get a good look from this guy." Eric shook his head and said, "What about you? There happens to be a movie premiere tonight. Do you want to come and join in the fun?" "Forget it. We'll have dinner together next time." Larry Ellison shook his head and said, "I'll go back to San Francisco with Steve." Eric nodded and didn't ask him to stay. He personally walked Larry Ellison to the mansion's parking lot. Jobs got into the car and didn't say goodbye, like a child in a fit of pique. Eric didn't mind. He walked the two of them out and turned to walk back to the mansion. He happened to see the twins coming from the gate of the mansion, each holding a box. When the twins came closer, Eric asked casually, "Did you buy new clothes?" Natasha opened the box in her hand and showed it to Eric. She said, "It's Master and the boss's evening clothes. Givenchy just sent it over." Eric saw a black suit inside and nodded. "Take it in." "Oh, is Drew awake?" "I don't know. When we came out to get the clothes, the boss was still asleep." Eric looked at his watch. It was just past 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A few days ago, when Eric was attending Chris' wedding in Maryland, the girl also flew to Europe to deploy the release of James Bond, Casino Royale. She returned to Los Angeles only 1 day earlier than Eric. She was still jet-lagged these days and would take a few hours of nap at noon every day. He thought he would spend the afternoon entertaining Larry Ellison and Steve Jobs. He didn't expect Steve Jobs to leave in the blink of an eye. When Eric walked into the mansion with the twins, he didn't disturb the girls' sleep. Instead, he went into the study and read the script of Iron Man that Marvel had just completed. They read until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. After the girl got up, the two put on their clothes and headed to the Hollywood Walk of Fame together. Tonight was the premiere of Firefly's first summer blockbuster, Prison in the Sky. The film would be released the day after tomorrow at the same time as Paramount's The Lion King 2. Prison in the Sky was a story about a retired soldier who was put in prison for manslaughter. He was loaded into a plane full of heinous criminals. However, although the story idea was ingenious, the core was still an imitation of the tough guy action movies like Die Hard. To be honest, Eric wasn't too optimistic about the commercial potential of this traditional Hollywood hero film. Moreover, since Thunderbolt and Mr. and Mrs. Smith adopted more beautiful and visually striking Eastern action movies, North American film fans had gradually lost interest in this type of traditional action movies. However, as the scale of Firefly Group grew, it was impossible for Eric to have enough energy to intervene in the production of all the films. It was inevitable that he would delegate the production power to his studios. This summer, Firefly's 3 movies were Prison in the Sky, Finding Nemo, and The Forest of Mount Tai, as well as the new Jedi Cop 2 and Final Destination 2. Strictly speaking, other than the initial project review, Eric did not intervene much in the detailed production. Prison in the Sky was produced by Bruckheimer and starred by Cage, who had a strong box office appeal in recent years. The production cost was also well controlled at $75 million. Coupled with Firefly's strong marketing and distribution, it was not difficult for the film to recover its costs and generate profits in the global box office. Because the recent showdown between Prison in the Sky and The Lion King 2 was hyped up by the media, although the two films didn't have much competition due to the theme, both Firefly and Paramount did their best to create various topics. Of course, they wouldn't let go of such an important event like the movie premiere. In addition to the main creators of Prison in the Sky, there were also a large number of big stars who were close to Firefly Group that night. The red carpet was full of stars. The reason why Eric brought Drew to the premiere of Prison in the Sky was also for the same reason. Perhaps it was because of the smooth cooperation with Michael Bay. Bruckheimer used another advertising director, Simon West, as the director of Prison in the Sky. Of course, this was also due to Eric's promotion. After all, without Eric's permission, Bruckheimer couldn't appoint a new director as the director of a $75 million budget film. The reason for this was because Simon West was the director of the original Prison in the Sky. Eric didn't have enough energy to intervene in all the films under Firefly, so creating the original cast was undoubtedly a very safe insurance. Eric and Drew arrived at the Chinese Grand Theater in Hollywood at 6 o'clock. As soon as they walked the red carpet, Jerry Bruckheimer and Simon West came to say hello. In his memory, although Simon West was not a prolific director, his movies such as Prison in the Sky, Tomb Raider, and The Expendables 2 were all very popular commercial films. Everyone stood at the end of the red carpet and chatted for a while. Eric came early, so he couldn't stand on the red carpet all the time. Just as they were about to enter the theater together, there was a faint movement behind him. He turned around and saw a tall figure in a red dress posing beautifully on the red carpet. The girl's name was Helena Christensen, and she was also a member of the Victoria's Secret Supermodels. She played the wife of Cage's character in Prison in the Sky. Under Emily's management, the Victoria's Secret Army had become more and more mature in recent years, and the Victoria's Secret supermodels were no longer replaced as frequently as in his previous life. Moreover, even if the ordinary Victoria's Secret angels couldn't receive the same treatment as the 5 spokespersons, compared to other models in the industry, they could still receive much more resources and exposure. Correspondingly, even if the salary for participating in the Victoria's Secret fashion show wasn't high, very few supermodels would voluntarily give up their Victoria's Secret angel status. Because the members of the Victoria's Secret Army were relatively fixed, with the cooperation of Firefly, Ltd began to further increase the influence of the Victoria's Secret Army outside of the Victoria's Secret fashion show every year. In recent years, frequent appearances in Hollywood films and TV series were one of the privileges that the Victoria's Secret angels could receive. Compared to the narrow audience of the fashion industry, the influence of the film industry was much greater. If they could appear in some blockbusters, even if it was a very small role, the influence would be much greater than appearing on the cover of some fashion magazines. Chapter 869. However, although Helena Christensen was an A-list supermodel from Victoria's Secret, it was not enough to cause a commotion on the red carpet for the premiere of Prison in the Sky. The reason for this was mainly because Leonardo DiCaprio appeared on the red carpet with Helena Christensen. After Titanic, Little Lee had immediately risen from a little fresh meat in the arts cafe to a Hollywood superstar. Looking at the scene in front of him, it was obvious that Little Lee, who had soared to the sky, could not wait to evolve in the direction of a supermodel bulldozer. Seeing Little Plum and Helena Christensen walking towards him arm in arm, Eric immediately had a bad feeling about this. There were millions of blonde models in the industry. If Little Lee was dating other models, Eric naturally would not care. However, if it involved the Victoria's Secret angels, then he could not. Back then, he had spent a year to create this group of beautiful babies. Although Eric would not treat them as his exclusive property, as a man, subconsciously, he was more resistant to the flowers that he had planted being plucked by others. If the person who plucked the flowers was called Little Lee, then it would be even worse. Although Little Lee was only dating Helena Christensen, this guy obviously would not let it go. He would definitely go to other Victoria's Secret angels. Of course, since he had seen it, this kind of thing obviously would not happen again. The two of them walked over. Seeing Eric, Helena Christensen immediately walked over happily and hugged Eric intimately. She said, "Oh, Eric, I'm so happy to see you tonight." Eric hugged the girl and smiled. "You're very beautiful tonight too." "Thank you." Helena Christensen nodded and warmly greeted Drew, Bruckheimer, Simon West, and the others. Seeing his girlfriend leave him without hesitation and walk over, Little Lee was obviously very unhappy. Although he also walked over to greet Eric and the others, his expression was obviously much more perfunctory. Under normal circumstances, the beyond grade as in Hollywood, such as Tom Cruise, Mel Gibson, Harrison Ford, and so on, were all targets that the upper echelons of the film studios would try to recruit. Little Lee's faint arrogance at this moment was probably the result of being coaxed by the upper echelons of the film studios. Ever since Firefly was established, they had never spoiled any Hollywood superstars, and obviously, they would never do so in the future. After shaking hands with Xiao Li, Eric said to Helena Christensen, "Come find me at the party later. I have something to discuss with you." Eric's voice was not loud, but everyone heard him clearly. Bruckheimer and Simon West's expressions were a little strange. The girl was still smiling and holding Eric's arm, and the displeasure on Xializi's face was more obvious. Helena Christensen was stunned for a moment. She glanced at little Lee and nodded obediently. After Eric said this, he did not stay any longer. He turned around and walked into the theater. After the lively red carpet ceremony, the premiere officially began. In the theater, because they had seen the sample more than once before, Eric and Jerry Bruckheimer, who was sitting next to him, did not pay attention to the screen. Looking at the scene of Cage fighting with the prisoners, Bruckheimer leaned over and asked, "Eric, what do you think the global box office will be?" "Didn't you see the box office forecast report from the distribution department?" Eric smiled and said, "My opinion is similar to theirs. More than $100 million in North America and $300 million worldwide." Bruckheimer said, "I just think that after Titanic, it should be higher, right?" "Jerry, Titanic was a complete accident. I dare say that movies that try to replicate the miracle of Titanic will not have a good ending." Bruckheimer shook his head and said, "Hey, you're too absolute. Can't you do it yourself?" Eric smiled and said, "I can't do it myself. In fact, neither can you. We can only be regarded as film businessmen now. We can basically guarantee that the movie we make will be a commercial success, but it's unlikely that we can create a box office miracle like Jim, because we have too many things to consider, such as budget, cost, marketing, and so on. Jim only thinks about the movie and doesn't have to worry about anything else, so he can make a masterpiece with all his heart." Bruckheimer nodded thoughtfully. Drew, who was sitting on the other side of Eric, leaned over and asked, "Then, Eric, how much box office do you think Paramount's Lion King 2 will get?" Eric shook his head and said, "I really don't know. However, Lion King 2 is not without its disadvantages." Lassie smiled and said, "Are you talking about marketing?" "That's also a very important factor, but there's also another point." Lassie tilted her head and began to stutter. Bruckheimer smiled and said, "I think it should be the cost, right?" Eric nodded with a smile. "Yes, the salary contract that Paramount signed with the hand-drawn animators has basically doubled. The production cycle of The Lion King 2 is almost a year longer than last year's Stranger in the Wind. Although Paramount hasn't announced the production budget of The Lion King 2, according to our estimates, the production cost of this animated film should be about $120 million. In comparison, our Finding Nemo only cost $90 million, and Blue Sky Studios' Ice Age cost even less, only $59 million, less than half of Lion King 2. Therefore, Lion King 2 probably needs to recover about $360 million in box office worldwide to break even. In comparison, Finding Nemo's global box office is $270 million, and Ice Age's is only $170 million. Lassie thought for a while and said, "The first Lion King's global box office was more than $900 million. Eric raised his hand and said to Cage, "Nick, this is not a simple matter. If you're very suitable for this role, I definitely won't hesitate. But to be honest, you're more suitable to play, well, the kind of wanderer who drifts around the world. But I want Tony Stark to be a playboy, a little crazy, a little neurotic, and even a little bit of a jerk." As soon as Eric's voice fell, Lassie, who was next to him, immediately began to stab him with a smile. Well, just like Eric. Ever since the news that the higher-ups of Marvel wanted Eric to play Iron Man himself reached Drew's ears, Lassie had been very enthusiastic about this matter. She even planned to play Pepper herself, and then let the Natasha sisters play Black Widow. Her original words were that they didn't even need to change the names, and the two sisters could even create some clones or something. Eric's comment was that the idea was good, but it was too messy. However, Cage and Bridget Fonda in front of him obviously did not take Lassie's words as a joke. Instead, they looked at Eric in surprise and asked, "Really?" "No." Eric pinched Lassie's white and tender face and said, "They're just messing around." However, Bridget Fonda's eyes still swept over Eric's body. She smiled and said, "Eric, I suddenly feel that you're really quite suitable." "Of course, I think so too." Eric smiled and said, "But it's not realistic to implement it." "Okay, back to the movies, Nick. You must like other comics besides Iron Man, right?" "Yeah, a lot. You know, my stage name is based on the superhero character Luke Cage." Eric nodded and said, "In that case, I definitely can't give you the role of Iron Man, but I think you'll definitely be very interested in another role. It's just that it's unlikely to start filming in the next few years, so you might have to wait for a long time." Although Cage was a little disappointed, he still asked, "Oh, what is it?" Eric smiled and said a name. Ghost Rider. In the original space-time, Cage had starred in 2 Ghost Rider movies in a row, but they were not very successful, which undoubtedly showed his love for this comic series. However, the character of Ghost Rider was also very popular among the Marvel superheroes. As long as he replanned it, with the support of the popularity of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe, the possibility of success in the future was still very high. As expected, Cage was interested again. He said, "Wow, of course I'm very interested in this. No, I should say that I'm more interested in this character than Tony Stark." "Eric, didn't Firefly start filming Spider-Man and Iron Man at the same time? Why can't they start filming Ghost Rider at the same time? By the way, I'm also willing to sign a long-term contract." Because the Marvel Cinematic Universe's production plan is carried out in stages, and this series will be scheduled for the second stage, which is about 10 years from now. In Eric's plan, the first stage of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was mainly set on Earth, and the theme was more towards sci-fi series like Spider-Man, Iron Man, Captain America, and the Hulk. But starting from the second stage, the Marvel Cinematic Universe would start to lean more toward fantasy and cosmic themes. At that time, the Ghost Rider and Doctor Strange series on Earth would also be brought to the big screen, as well as the Guardians of the Galaxy and the Guardians of the Infinite series. 10 years was clearly a little long. Cage obviously didn't have that much patience. He chatted with Eric for a while, hoping that he could slightly change the plan. Eric naturally wouldn't change it so easily. Instead, it was Bridget Fonda who wanted to play the role of Pepper, and Eric solemnly said that he would consider it carefully. Everyone chatted for a while. After Cage and Bridget Fonda left, another tall figure in red walked over. Chapter 870. Helena Christensen walked over to Eric with a glass of red wine and sat down beside him. She snuggled up to him naturally and asked coquettishly, "Eric, how was my acting?" Smelling the feminine scent that was completely different from the lass's, Eric smiled and nodded. "Yes, not bad." "It's just not bad." Helena Christensen seemed to be a little dissatisfied with this evaluation. She wanted to say something, but her eyes inadvertently noticed the devilish smile on the fair and tender face of the lass beside her. She seemed to have thought of something and immediately put away her coquettish attitude. She even said to the lass in an obviously fawning tone, "Drew, when are you coming to New York next time? Let's hang out together?" "Sure." The lass smiled and nodded, looking harmless. In the blink of an eye, she yawned and leaned against Eric to stretch. She said, "Eric, I'm so sleepy. I'm going back to sleep first." Eric could feel that Helena Christensen was a little afraid of the lass. Although he was a little curious, he didn't care. He held the lass's slender waist lovingly and helped her up. He said, "I can't leave now. There are many people I haven't greeted yet. You should go back first." The lass leaned over and pecked Eric's lips affectionately. She glanced at Helena Christensen and smiled. "I'm going back to Trousdale Manor. I don't care if you want to come over or not." "Oh, go ahead. I'll go over later." Eric patted the lass's waist. After watching her leave with the twins, he smiled and asked Helena Christensen, "Did Drew teach you guys a lesson?" After the lass left, Helena Christensen immediately relaxed again. When she heard Eric's question, she recalled what happened during the Met Ball charity ball at the beginning of the month. She shook her head and said, "No, we're just little girls. We don't dare to provoke Drew." "Looks like you guys were taught a lesson," Eric said with a smile, but didn't ask further. He believed that the lass still knew her limits. Of course, even if she lost her sense of propriety, it didn't matter. Glancing around, Eric changed the topic and asked, "Are they gone?" Helena Christensen nodded helplessly. "Yeah, she's angry. We'll just have to coax her tomorrow." Eric shook his head and said, "There's no need to coax him. Break up with him." "What?" Helena Christensen asked subconsciously. In the blink of an eye, her expression became somewhat aggrieved and resentful. "Eric, I feel that this should be my private matter." Eric had always found it strange that most of the sprites in the Victoria's Secret Army would show such resentful faces in front of him. Could it be that they had discussed this beforehand? He felt that this kind of thinking was a little exaggerated. Perhaps all beautiful women were like this. Eric tossed this thought aside and said, "Of course it's your personal matter. This is just my personal suggestion. Also, since you happen to be here today, help me spread a rumor in the Angel Corps." Helena Christensen couldn't keep up with Eric's sudden change in topic. Puzzled, she asked, "Rumor? What is it?" "Oh, it's said that in the future, all the supermodels who date Leon will be kicked out of the Victoria's Secret Army. Even the 5 spokespeople are no exception." Helena Christensen's emerald eyes widened. She stuttered, is this a rumor?" Eric nodded. "Yes, if you don't believe me, you can try." "But this," Helena Christensen stuttered. Suddenly, she was discouraged. Her expression became resentful again. She glared at Eric like an angry kitten and said, Okay, Eric, I'll break up with him tomorrow. Also, I'll help you spread, rumors. But you should at least tell me why, right?" Eric said, "Just do as I say obediently. Women shouldn't ask so many questions." "What a male chauvinist," Helena Christensen said. Her body leaned over again, and her expression became charming again. She said, "Eric, don't tell me you want all of us to keep our chastity for you like the Holy Virgin of the Church? That's too much. You're not God." Eric felt the girl's soft body almost sticking to him. He reached out his hand and caressed her exquisitely made-up face. He said, "You're wrong. I'm your God. I've never forced others to believe in me. But if you give up this belief, you'll be demoted to the mortal world and will no longer be angels." "Oh, Eric, you're not God. You're the devil." Eric's fingertips seemed to be releasing electricity. Helena Christensen felt her body go soft. She forced herself to mutter. She pulled herself together and tilted her head. She opened her small mouth and bit one of Eric's fingers. She bared her small white teeth and looked at him threateningly. Eric teased the soft little tongue a few times, then easily retracted his finger. He patted the girl's waist and said, "Let's go. Follow me to entertain the guests. We'll go dancing together later." The premiere of Prison in the Sky was held on May 28th. The next day, The Lion King 2 held a grand premiere in the same theater. Thus, on May 30th, Prison in the Sky and The Lion King 2 were officially released in major theaters in North America. Because the North American media was closely watching the situation of the two movies, many newspapers began to give reviews of the two movies on the day of the movie's release. However, this time, the situation seemed to be very unfavorable for Firefly. According to preliminary statistics, the comprehensive evaluation score of Prison in the Sky in newspapers and on the internet barely reached the passing line of 6 points. The Lion King 2, by Roger Ailes of Paramount Animation, did not disappoint many people. The initial film review score was close to 9 points, which could be said to be a tide of good reviews. Moreover, the story of The Lion King 2 was focused on Simba's story after he became an adult. This change was obviously more suitable for the older audience. A long day passed. On the evening of May 30th, although it was Friday, many company executives were still gathered at the Paramount headquarters in Hollywood. Sam Redstone, the chairman of Viacom, sat at the head of the conference table. Although he still maintained his composure, sitting next to him were Paramount CEO Shirley Lansing and the director of The Lion King 2, Roger Ailes, who were on the other side. The people casually discussed some of the recent trivial matters. The movie had already been released. At this time, it was useless to worry about anything. All they could wait for was the final box office results of The Lion King 2. Although the online media and today's evening news were almost one-sided praise for The Lion King 2, because the early distribution and marketing work was heavily hindered by Firefly and Fox, Paramount was still full of doubts about the box office prospects of The Lion King 2. Lei Shedong was 74 years old this year. Although he was still very healthy, he rarely stayed up late like today. It was inevitable that he was a little tired. After finishing the cup of coffee in front of him, Lei Shedong motioned his secretary to pour him another cup of coffee. Lei Shedong raised his wrist and looked at his watch. It was just past 12 o'clock. It should be June 1st now. Although he had a general idea, Lei Shedong could not help but ask Shirley Lansing next to him, "Shirley, when will the preliminary box office statistics come out?" Most cinemas have the last screening every day at around 11 o'clock at night. At that time, some cinemas have already begun to calculate the preliminary box office. However, if you want to get the results, you have to wait until at least 1 o'clock in the morning, Shirley Lansing explained. "Sam, why don't you go back and rest first? I'll call you when the results come out." "No, it's okay. I'm not so old that I can't walk." Lei Shedong stubbornly shook his head and refused. Thinking of the recent experience, a flash of anger appeared on his face again. He said to his assistant sitting not far away, "Jack, is there a reply from Larry Tisch?" "Mr. Lei Shedong, I called this afternoon. They said that Mr. Tisch is currently in Europe and will be back in about a week." "Humph, he's waiting for the best price," Lei Shedong muttered. Larry Tisch was the largest shareholder of CBS television network. Over the years, CBS's operating situation had been very bad, and Larry Tisch always had the idea of selling the network. 2 years ago, Larry Tisch also negotiated an acquisition with QVC controlled by Barry Diller. At that time, the deal almost went through, but because Comcast, which was behind Barry Diller, was not optimistic about the deal, they cut off financial support for Barry Diller. This almost successful deal was unexpectedly ruined. Although in recent years, Lei Shedong had continuously annexed companies such as the Blockbuster chain, Paramount Pictures, and Disney Animation Studio, many shareholders of Viacom hoped that Lei Shedong could temporarily slow down his expansion. However, due to the joint marketing boycott of The Lion King 2 by Firefly and Fox, Lei Shedong finally made up his mind to launch an acquisition of CBS to make up for Viacom's shortcomings in media marketing channels. However, due to the rise of new technology in recent years, the television industry had also risen, so the initiative of this acquisition fell to CBS. After Viacom expressed their intention to acquire, Larry Tisch, who had been eager to get rid of CBS, became more cautious this time. The time in the middle of the night always seemed a little long. Time slowly passed by, and after a long time, it was finally 1 o'clock in the morning. The fax machine in the corner of the conference room suddenly made a clicking sound. Everyone was shocked as they looked over with anticipation and anxiety. Brian Barkley, the president of Paramount's distribution department, was sitting next to the fax machine. Seeing that Lei Shedong and the other two did not move, he got up and took out the datasheet that was just faxed over. Unsurprisingly, the box office of The Lion King 2 appeared at the top of the list. $12. 8 million. When Brian Barkley saw this number, he began to calculate quickly in his mind. Under normal circumstances, the box office trend for the 3-day weekend would be $12. 8 million on the first day. On Saturday, the box office would show a certain amount of increase and drop again on Sunday. According to the box office data on the first day, the box office of The Lion King 2 should be around $40 million for the 3-day weekend. Before Brian Barkley had time to think further, Lei Shedong coughed softly in his ear. "Hey Brian, what's the result?" Brian Barkley suddenly woke up. Seeing that everyone in the conference room was looking at him, he quickly smiled and said, "Very good. $12. $8 million on the first day. The box office for the first weekend should be close to $40 million. As Brian Barkley spoke, he handed the box office data to Lei Shedong and the other two. Lei Shedong eagerly looked at the fax paper. Shirley Lansing and Roger Ailes, who were on both sides, also leaned over. Since they had already heard the numbers reported by Brian Barkley, the three of them looked down at the same time, looking for the box office number of Prison in the Sky on the first day. They noticed the result at a glance. $7. $7 million. Shirley Lansing murmured, $7. $7 million on the first day and $25 million on the first weekend. We won. Although the other company executives present couldn't see the data, they obviously knew that the second set of numbers mentioned by Shirley Lansing was referring to the movie. They all whispered excitedly at the same time. Roger Ailes didn't care too much about the box office of Prison in the Sky. In fact, many people knew that the two movies with completely different themes were not comparable. Roger Ailes was more concerned about the box office comparison between The Lion King 2 and The Lion King. The estimated box office of $40 million in the three-day weekend was about $10 million lower than the $49 million box office of the first movie. This result was obviously very disappointing. Lei Shedong listened to Shirley Lansing explain in a low voice the various possible box office trends of The Lion King 2 based on the first day's situation. He looked very satisfied. Noticing Roger Ailes' disappointed expression, Lei Shedong patted him on the shoulder and said, "Roger, don't be like this. You have done a great job. Everyone knows that the box office of The Lion King 2 is lower than the first movie, not because the movie you made is not good enough. If we have enough marketing resources, the box office of The Lion King 2 will definitely reach or even surpass the first movie's results." "Yes, Roger," Shirley Lansing also said. "Also, according to the reputation of The Lion King 2, it is not impossible for the box office to reverse the next week. No one said that only fireflies can make a movie like Titanic." When Shirley Lansing said this, many people immediately thought of Godzilla, which was going to be released next week. Under the intense marketing bombardment of Sony Pictures, almost no one doubted that Godzilla would be a box office monster. But obviously, no one would say anything to dampen the mood at this time. Looking at the $7 million box office of Prison in the Sky on the first day, many people felt that if Prison in the Sky was hit next week, the audience would obviously be more miserable. Chapter 871. In Beverly Hills, Eric had been living in the girls' mansion in Trousdale Manor for the past 2 days. He didn't stay up all night like many of Paramount's executives. Although it was Saturday, he still woke up on time, washed up, did morning exercises, had breakfast, and sat on the balcony overlooking Los Angeles to read the new day's newspaper. As if to make some kind of counterattack, Paramount couldn't wait to publish Friday's box office rankings in the newspaper. The twins quietly cleared away the tableware on the round table. The girl sat opposite Eric and also read the Los Angeles Times on the table. She said in surprise, "If it's estimated to be $40 million in the first 3 days, won't it be more than $60 million in the first week? It's about the same as the first movie. Doesn't that mean our plan to ban it has failed?" Eric shook his head with a smile and said, "Usually, it's correct to calculate that the weekday box office is equivalent to half of the weekend box office. It's different for animated movies, especially 2D ones, because most of the audience are children who need their parents to accompany them. The weekday box office ratio will be lower." The box office of the first Lion King was close to 70% of the first week's box office in the first 3 days. This sequel will definitely be similar, so it's unlikely to exceed $60 million in the first week. It should be around $55 million. $55 million in the first week. How much will the total box office be? Eric read a review of Prison in the Sky. He thought for a moment and said, "That's hard to say. The total box office of Lion King 2 mainly depends on its box office performance in the first 4 weeks. After this week, it'll be Godzilla next week, followed by Finding Nemo and Transdimensional Contact, and then Batman and Robin. These are all movies that can pose a great threat to Lion King 2. If these movies perform too well at the box office, Lion King 2 will definitely be affected. On the other hand, it's not impossible for Lion King 2's box office to be close to the first movies. In fact, Eric already had some ideas based on the memories of his previous life. In the next 3 weeks, Godzilla and Batman and Robin were very likely to flop. Only Finding Nemo was the most direct opponent of The Lion King 2. However, the current Prison in the Sky did not seem to meet expectations. It was $7 million on the first day and could only earn about $35 million in the first week. Under the bombardment of blockbusters in the next few weeks, it was still uncertain whether the North American box office could exceed $100 million. The poor performance of Prison in the Sky made Eric uncertain about the box office prospects of Finding Nemo. He had seen this 3D animation several times. Although the quality was not inferior to the original version, it was released 6 years earlier than the original version. It was very uncertain whether it could still show the amazing box office explosive power. When the girl heard Eric say this, she lowered her head and flipped through the entertainment section. She found the schedule of the summer movies. After looking at it for a while, she looked up and said, "Then, it seems that only Godzilla and our Casino Royale may be close to $1 billion at the global box office during the summer. It seems that you are also stimulated by Titanic. It is so easy to reach $1 billion at the global box office. Hollywood is lucky to have a dark horse with a global box office of $1 billion at the global box office every year. This year, Eric hesitated and did not say the name of Finding Nemo. He paused and said, "There may be one this year, but it will definitely not be Godzilla or Casino Royale." "Ah, you don't have confidence either?" Eric analyzed. "You see, the global box office of The Last GoldenEye was $350 million. Without accounting for inflation, this is 007's best result. In fact, this also shows the box office potential of 007 in its original form. For this Casino Royale, I am not sure if the audience will like it because of the changes I made to the plot of the movie. However, with the combination of the 007 brand, my personal box office appeal, and the halo of the secret agent movie universe, it is not a big problem for this movie to exceed $500 million at the global box office. If it explodes a little, it may be able to reach $700 million. However, it will take a lot of luck to reach $1 billion. The girl rolled her eyes and said, "Then, when the final battle between the 3 major secret agent organizations and the Ghost Gang, is it possible to reach $1 billion? Eric remembered that in the original space-time, after the first Avengers was released, the box office of Captain America and Thor, 2 series of mediocre first box office sequels, almost doubled. The box office of Iron Man, which was already very popular, exceeded $1 billion. The reason for this situation was largely because of the gathering of many superheroes, which increased the popularity and box office appeal of the original hero. The 3 secret agent movie series, 007, Mission Impossible, and The Breakin' Doll, were already very popular. Casino Royale happened to be the first movie where the 3 series intersected. After this movie, the fans of the 3 secret agent movies would definitely merge. Even if Casino Royale did not improve the original series as much as the Avengers, as long as the intersecting plot was maintained in the sequels, there might be a movie that could reach $1 billion at the global box office before the final battle of the Ghost Gang. Of course it is possible. We don't even have to wait until the final battle. Eric nodded. Suddenly, he thought of something. He put down the newspaper in his hand and created a blank document on the laptop next to him. As he typed on the keyboard, he said, "However, I suddenly thought of something. In the next series, you should pay attention to some things. I'll write a memo for you." The girl came over curiously and asked, "What is it?" Eric continued typing on the keyboard and explained, "It's about the supporting roles. Look, whether it's 007, Mission Impossible, or The Breakin' Doll, there are more outstanding supporting roles, such as Mrs. M, Dr. Q, and so on. After Casino Royale, it won't be a problem to film another 10 movies in the Secret Agent movie universe series. However, if that's the case, The production cost will be very high if we want the main characters of the 3 series to make cameos with each other. At this time, it's very cost-effective to let the supporting roles in the series achieve this kind of interspersed effect. Even like Mission Impossible, Kevin Costner's salary is getting higher and higher. If it's difficult for both sides to continue working together in the end, we can even use the original popular supporting role to continue leading the Mission Impossible department and continue the Mission Impossible series. The girl looked at the document that Eric quickly typed out and roughly understood. She nodded with a smile and said, "Just like how you promised Christina to act in that racing movie as Angela Linda in Casino Royale?" Eric's fingers that were typing on the keyboard paused. He patted the round table and said, "Yeah, I almost forgot about this movie. It's all because I've been too busy recently. I'll find some time to write the outline in the next 2 days. You can go and find a few suitable screenwriters to fill in the script." "Hee," the girl laughed and said, "Give it back to us. Liz will definitely be angrier. Maybe Jeffrey will have a problem with it too." Eric had indeed given her too many popular movies over the years. Needless to say, the Secret Agent movie universe, Night at the Museum, Resident Evil, Forrest Gump, and other movies were all extremely popular projects that people coveted. Next, there was Thor King's Middle-earth epic series, which was enough to feed a movie company for 10 years. It seemed that even Drew himself hoped that Eric would not be so obviously biased anymore. Eric smiled and kissed the girl's cheek. He said, "I'll let it go this time. You can continue to hold on to it. I hope that this racing series can be linked to the Secret Agent movie universe. If it's placed in other movie companies, although they can still achieve a crossover, because the theme is relatively different, doing so will seem too deliberate. There will also be a lot of copyright disputes that can't be resolved. Firefly has never been short of projects. Fox is now working on Star Wars, the prequel. Mira and Mike's performance in the past 2 years has also been very eye-catching. There's also Julia, the box office star, supporting them. Other than lacking some big productions, their movie business is not much worse than yours. Besides, Fox's foundation is much stronger than MGM's. Fox had been taken over by News Corporation for more than 10 years. Although their movie business was not very good, with the support of News Corporation, Fox's operating conditions were still very stable. In comparison, MGM's current business was still limited to movies. Although it began to recover under the stimulation of a series of popular blockbusters, its overall strength was still at the bottom of the 7 major studios. The girl of course knew that Eric wanted MGM to become stronger as soon as possible and play a bigger role in Firefly's media system. She nodded and did not refuse. She said, "Oh yeah, Eric, last time Amy discussed with me. We happened to have an opportunity to buy a cable television station. If MGM wanted to go further, they definitely needed to expand into the television industry." Eric's original idea was for MGM to buy CBS and Sony's Columbia Pictures. However, due to the rise of new technology, CBS was now worth more than $20 billion. Sony also had no intention of selling their movie business, so these two ideas were not feasible for the time being. Therefore, expanding into the cable television industry was a good choice. In the next 20 years, the North American public television network was destined to decline, but the cable television industry would enter its heyday. Eric sent the written memo to MGM CEO, Amy Pascal's email, and asked the girl, "Which TV station is it?" Entertainment. Eric raised his eyebrows slightly and immediately remembered. It was the TV station in the original space-time. Oh no, the TV station with the Kardashians. Eric nodded and said, "This TV station, I've heard of it, but I didn't pay much attention." The girl introduced, "I've read the information. Entertainment mainly broadcasts movies, TV, music, and other programs related to fashion. Oh, and Hollywood gossip." Eric asked subconsciously, "Is there no reality show?" The girl tilted her head, "I don't think so, but if we can buy it, we can definitely make our own reality show." "It's a waste of resources for this kind of TV station not to broadcast reality shows, but we also need to plan well," Eric said and asked, "Now, which company owns the company?" "That's a bit complicated, Entertainment was originally set up by 5 companies: Warner Cable, Comcast, Long Distance Communications, Continental TV, and Basic Cable. It has been integrated several times over the years, and Continental TV and Basic Cable have withdrawn. This time, Time Warner also wants to withdraw and is looking for interested buyers. We can buy about 40% of the shares at most, but Con Nast said that if we take over Warner Cable's shares, we should be able to get Entertainment's operating rights. North American cable television started to rise in the 1980s. At that time, in order to avoid investment risks and make full use of each company's resources, it was basically in the form of a partnership, just like Firefly and Hearst Group still jointly owned AE Network and ESPN. Then let's buy 40% first, and if there's a chance in the future, we'll buy the whole TV station. But I think it's a bit expensive. Entertainment, including a few sub-channels, has less than 50 million subscribers. Last year's revenue was only $370 million, and they lost $13 million. Warner Cable offered $750 million for less than 40% of the shares, and Amy said that this price is negotiable, but it won't be less than $600 million. If it was a paid cable TV station, the 50 million subscribers would definitely make a lot of money for the shareholders, but Entertainment obviously relied on advertising and the operator's share of the revenue as the foundation of the cable TV station. In the past 2 years, just like CBS, whether it was a public TV network or a cable TV station, they were stimulated by the wave of new technology, and the price soared. If it was a few years ago, according to the current financial situation, Entertainment's overall value would not exceed the $750 million quoted by Warner Cable, but now, Warner Cable's price for $750 million for 40% of Entertainment shares was not too outrageous. Time Warner's financial situation was not very good in recent years, and Warner Cable was probably thinking of cashing out at a high price while getting rid of the burden. Buy as much as you can, Eric said to the girl after thinking about it. In a few years, even if you want to buy it, no one will sell it. The past few years were the final stages of the integration of the North American media industry. When all the dust settled, the development of cable TV stations would also become better and better. The major media groups that had already become giants would certainly not easily sell their cable TV stations. It could be said that the next few years were almost the last opportunity for MGM to expand into the TV industry. The girl did not doubt Eric's judgment at all. She nodded and said, "Okay, I'll call Amy right now." As they were talking, Natasha came out of the mansion with a cordless phone in her hand. She handed it to Drew and said, "Boss, it's Miss Hudson." Chapter 872. When Eric heard Drew take the phone and call out, "Kate," he could roughly guess who was on the other end of the line. Kate Hudson, still one of Hollywood's second-generation heiresses, the daughter of the first-generation American sweetheart, Cody Hahn. Speaking of which, due to her extroverted and playful personality, Drew's social circle was more than 10 times larger than Eric's. With the revival of MGM in recent years, there were naturally more people who wanted to make friends with Drew, and her social circle was getting wider and wider. Due to her family background and her rising status in Hollywood, the second generation, third generation, and daughters of other rich and famous people in Hollywood who were her age could be considered as her closest group of girlfriends. Drew chatted with Kate Hudson on the other end of the phone for a while. Her words seemed to have rejected some invitation from the other party, and then she hung up the phone. Eric looked over curiously, but Drew thought that Eric was interested in the person on the other end of the phone, so she took the initiative to explain, "It's Kate Hudson. Maybe you don't know her, but you definitely know her mother, Cody Hahn." Eric then realized that in this time and space, it should be the first time he heard the name Kate Hudson. Nodding with a smile, Eric said, "Cody Hahn, I remember that she has a set of pictures full of human graffiti. Short blonde hair, wearing a bikini, and looking pretty. I just forgot where I saw it." As Eric spoke, he opened the browser on his laptop and typed on the keyboard to search. Although there were already many pictures of Cody Hahn on the internet, unfortunately, the picture resources were far less abundant than later. He could not find the set of pictures in his memory, which was quite disappointing. Drew leaned next to Eric, looking at the laptop screen, and said with a smile, "Eric, if you like, I can help you find it." "Forget it, I don't have a hobby of collecting these things." Eric smiled and asked, "Why did she look for you just now?" However, Drew remembered the details of what had just happened. When he heard Eric ask, he said, "She asked me if I was going to the yoga class today. I want to accompany you at home, so I won't be going." Eric asked curiously, "When did you become interested in yoga?" "I've been practicing for 3 months. It's said that I can maintain my body shape." Drew twisted his waist and leaned over to act coquettishly. "Don't you feel that my waist has become softer recently?" Eric thought of the extra yoga mats in the villa's gym. However, Drew had obviously been slacking off these 2 days. He reached out and stroked the girl's small waist to feel it. He smiled and said, "Yes, it's even softer. Since that's the case, you should persevere. Anyway, you have nothing to do with me at home. You can continue with your classes." Drew rolled his eyes and said, "Then come with me." Eric tapped twice on the laptop keyboard and said, "There are still a bunch of unread emails in the mailbox. You can go by yourself. I should be able to finish reading them in the morning." However, Drew became even more interested. He simply closed Eric's laptop and said, "Let's go together. Work will never be finished. If you continue like this, you will become an old man sooner or later." "Okay, stop it. I'll turn off the computer first." Eric was pestered by the girl, so he had no choice but to surrender. He opened the laptop and turned it off. Seeing that Eric agreed, Drew immediately ordered the twins to prepare the car and props. He did not forget to pick up the phone and call Amy Pascal. They briefly talked about the acquisition of Entertainment TV station. Then, he called Kate Hudson and said that he would still be going to the yoga class. Eric turned off his phone and closed the laptop. When Drew hung up the phone, he asked, "Will the yoga class last the whole day?" Drew casually placed the cordless phone on the round table and said, "No, it's only 2 hours on Saturday and Sunday. Usually, we only need to practice for 20 minutes at home." "Then what do we do after the yoga class?" "We originally planned to have yoga class together in the morning, have lunch together at noon, go shopping on Rodeo Avenue in the afternoon, and have a party at Kate's house in the evening." Eric clicked his tongue and was a little envious. "Your days are really good. Of course I have to play on the weekend. I won't let myself become a workaholic. What's the point of living if that's the case?" Eric suddenly thought of something and said, "According to what you said, the people with you today should be girls. Is it appropriate for me to join them?" "Haha, I think it will be very interesting." Eric was a little hesitant. A man like him working out, shopping, eating, and having a party with a group of girls would definitely not feel good. However, the twins drove a black Range Rover out of the garage and stuffed the yoga bag and other props into the car. At this time, they had already looked over. Drew giggled and pulled Eric up. "Let's go, haha. Since you're here, we'll definitely adjust the schedule." Eric was pulled away by the girl. He suddenly wanted to bring his laptop with him. If he was too bored, maybe he could find time to write the outline of Fast and Furious. However, before he could do that, he was pulled into the car. The Range Rover left Trousdale Manor and drove less than 2 kilometers south to the bustling business district at the foot of Beverly Hills. The car drove into the parking lot of a yoga club near Sunset Boulevard. The moment the girl got out of the car from the other side, 7 or 8 girls who were chatting in the parking lot gathered around. Eric opened the door on the other side and casually glanced around. He recognized the 2 girls in the lead. They were Gwyneth Paltrow and Kate Hudson. Perhaps noticing that Eric got out of the car from the other side, one of the girls asked curiously, "Hey, Drew, who else is there?" The girl giggled and said, "Guess." Eric walked around the car, and the group of girls' eyes instantly gathered on him. Perhaps it was because they were outdoors during the day, but this feeling was completely different from the night at Giselle's place. After a short silence, a girl shrieked softly, "Ah, it's Eric." Eric could only wave his hand. Hi, everyone. Seeing that most of the other girls were hesitant, Gwyneth Paltrow felt an inexplicable sense of superiority. Drew had never introduced Eric to them before. Among the group of girls, she was the only one who had interacted with Eric before. Walking over warmly, Gwyneth Paltrow extended her hands to Eric. Hey Eric, I didn't expect you to come today. Yeah, actually, I didn't expect it either. Eric joked and hugged her. Seeing Gwyneth Paltrow's face, he wasn't used to this kind of intimate kiss, but he still kissed her gently on the cheek before separating from her. He looked around at the other girls who were walking over. To Eric's surprise, other than Gwyneth Paltrow and Kate Hudson, there were two other familiar faces in the group of girls. Looking at the two youthful and reserved faces squeezed out of the crowd, Eric could only sigh at how small the world was. The girl had just mentioned to him that she wanted to buy It's about entertainment. Noticing that Eric was looking at them, the taller blonde girl waved her small hand at Eric and boldly introduced herself. Hello, Mr. Williams. I'm Paris Hilton. Eric smiled and inadvertently glanced at the black-haired girl beside Paris Hilton, who seemed to have some Latino ancestry. He nodded and said, Hello, Miss Hilton. Drew walked over and intimately held Eric's arm and said, Okay, Eric, let's go in first. Otherwise, we might be surrounded. The group of girls walked into the yoga club. The receptionist at the front desk saw the girls walk in, and just as she smiled, she was obviously shocked by Eric and was almost speechless. Drew went up and said a few words to the receptionist, and the group went straight to the practice room on the second floor. The receptionist opened the door and respectfully left. Drew walked in with Eric and explained, I've already booked this place. No one will disturb us. With the girl's current financial status, she could totally get a personal trainer to teach her yoga classes alone. Choosing this place was obviously still a decision of her personality. Eric looked at the hundreds of square meters of space around him and felt even more uncomfortable. He couldn't accompany this group of girls to practice yoga, could he? There should be a lounge here, right? Why don't I wait for you there? The girl pointed to a small lounge in the corner of the practice room, where there was a bench and a bookshelf. With a mischievous smile on her face, she said, There, we'll go change first. Hee hee. As she spoke, the girl let go of Eric's arm and ordered the twins behind her to follow her to the dressing room. The other girls also followed. Eric shook his head helplessly and walked to the so-called lounge and sat down. He casually took out an entertainment magazine from the bookshelf and looked at the cover. He couldn't help but chuckle. On the cover was a picture of Xiao Li and Helena Christensen. There was a lightning-like crack in the middle of the picture. On the page was printed in bold English, Leonardo's relationship with Victoria's Secret angel girlfriend broke up. It was rumored that the girl took the initiative to break up with him. Just as he was about to open the magazine to read the main text, the door of the practice room was pushed open. A few girls walked in while chatting. Behind them was a tall and beautiful woman wearing a white sports vest and tight pants. She should be the club's coach. Noticing that Eric was sitting in the lounge, the girls' faces were almost filled with disbelief. Obviously, they were doubting whether the person sitting there was really a guy named Eric Williams. Eric had to take the initiative to point to the dressing room and said, There, go in. Drew and the others have already started to change. Ah, it's true, it's alive. Hearing Eric's words, a blonde girl blurted out subconsciously. She seemed to realize that her words were a bit inappropriate and immediately covered her mouth. The other girls laughed heartlessly and cheerfully waved at Eric before walking to the dressing room. The girls' figures disappeared, and the woman in yoga clothes behind them walked towards Eric. The woman was about 30 years old. Her skin was slightly dark, and she obviously had the characteristics of a mixed race. However, because of this, the shape of her face was also very soft. She had a head of black hair and light brown eyes. Perhaps because she had been practicing yoga for a long time, she had a gentle temperament. Hello, Mr. Williams. My name is Victoria Price. I'm the owner of this club. Seeing the woman slightly bowing and reaching out to him, Eric politely stood up and shook her fair little hand. Feeling the fingertips of the other party, intentionally or unintentionally, brushed against his palm, Eric's expression didn't change much. He still smiled and said, "Hello, Miss Price." Victoria Price's expression also didn't change much. She said, "Mr. Williams, we also have men's exercise clothes here. Do you need them?" Eric smiled and shook his head. He waved the magazine in his hand and said, "No, I'll read the magazine for a while and watch Drew and the others practice." Victoria Price didn't give up easily. She said, "Actually, I think you should contact yoga. It's a kind of exercise that can quickly calm people down from nervousness." Eric had a way to calm himself down, so he shook his head again and said, "Forget it, I'm not used to this kind of exercise." Victoria Price obviously still didn't give up. She pulled out a business card from the gap of her thin sports vest and handed it to Eric. She said, "Mr. Williams, this is my business card. Perhaps you will need it one day." Eric watched the woman's movements and slightly raised his eyebrows. He took the business card and put it in front of his nose to smell it. There was a faint fragrance of a woman on the business card. Nodding with a smile, Eric put the business card in his shirt pocket and said, "Okay, I'll call you if I need it." Victoria Price's face finally turned a little red, especially when she heard the sound of the fitting room door opening. She was obviously shocked. She said, "Then I'll go and prepare first." With that, the woman turned and left. Gwyneth Paltrow and a few other girls walked out first. They suspiciously looked at Victoria Price's back as she hurriedly left. Then, they smiled and walked over to Eric as if they were close friends. She sat down next to him and said, "Eric, long time no see. What have you been busy with recently?" Eric looked at Paris Hilton and Gwyneth Paltrow who walked out behind her. He said casually, "Many things. What about you?" Gwyneth followed Eric's gaze and looked over. Her expression changed slightly, and she said to Paris Hilton without holding back, "Paris, can you help me lay out a yoga mat? Just put it there." Gwyneth said as she pointed to an area about 3 to 4 meters away from them. "You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.